Nell apologized before I could even reach her. My 12-year-old daughter sat with one hand pressed to the cheek my sister had just slapped, while the serving spoon rocked against her plate. She had done nothing except take food for herself before serving everyone else. Valerie told her she had forgotten her place. My mother said adopted children needed stricter teaching. I pushed back my chair and took Nell's hand. You just lost everything. But as I led my children out, I caught Rowan staring at her mother, not shocked by the slap, but terrified by what it seemed to mean. I hope you're doing well, wherever you're listening from. Stay with me to the end, and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. 40 minutes earlier, the most serious argument at my parents' dinner table had been about bread. My 10-year-old son Owen had studied the basket of dinner rolls as though he were examining evidence in a federal case. He had already selected one, then noticed that the roll beside it was perhaps half an inch wider. This apparently constituted an injustice severe enough to require his father's attention. Ben leaned over, inspected both rolls with exaggerated concentration, and informed him that if Owen intended to pursue a claim based on bread dimensions, he would need to provide measurements. Owen objected to the burden of proof. Nell laughed so suddenly that lemonade nearly came out her nose. Across the table, Rowan covered her mouth and laughed too. That was the part of the evening I kept coming back to. Afterward, not the slap at first, not my mother's words, not even the sound of the serving spoon striking porcelain. I remembered the laughter because it had been ordinary. No one had known we were sitting inside the last few minutes of a version of our family that would never exist again. My parents' anniversary dinners had always been formal enough to make my mother happy and casual enough for my father to pretend they weren't formal at all. Diane had put out the linen napkins she saved for holidays and occasions she considered too important for paper. Russell had opened a bottle of wine before we arrived and positioned himself near the kitchen island, where he could refill glasses, while technically never becoming responsible for the cooking. Valerie had handled everything else. She always did. By 6:30 she had adjusted the oven temperature twice, moved a vase because she thought it blocked conversation, switched Owen's chair because he was too close to a lamp, and reorganized the serving dishes, according to the order she wanted them passed around the table. None of it seemed strange. Valerie was an operations manager for a regional dental group, and she had carried that same air of controlled efficiency into family gatherings for as long as I could remember. If something needed doing, Valerie noticed it. If nobody else noticed it quickly enough, she assigned it. I had spent 40 years accepting that as one of the fixed features of my sister, like the small scar beneath her chin, or the way she always checked a restaurant reservation twice. Ben noticed it more than I did. He had once told me that visiting my family felt like arriving at an airport where Valerie was air traffic control. He had meant it affectionately then. That night when we walked in, Valerie had kissed my cheek, pointed Ben toward the wine, told Owen where his coat belonged, and handed Nell a stack of folded napkins before the girl had even taken off her shoes. Nell accepted them without complaint. I remember that because she tucked her hair behind one ear, balanced the napkins against her chest, and asked where Valerie wanted them. She did it with the same easy competence she used at home when she helped Ben unload groceries or carried laundry upstairs. Nothing in me sounded an alarm. That fact would become harder to live with later. At 12, Nell had grown into a long-limbed child, who still occasionally forgot how much space her elbows occupied. She had been 7 when her adoption became final. By then, Ben and I had already learned that official documents could change a child's legal status in a day, while belonging happened in hundreds of smaller moments. Who knew she hated grape jelly, who remembered she slept with the blanket turned to the smooth side, who sat beside her when a school assignment asked for a baby picture she didn't have. By 12, she was simply Nell, my daughter, Owen's older sister, the person in our house most likely to hide the last chocolate chip cookie behind the vegetable drawer because she knew Owen would never look there. I had worked hard not to make every family interaction about adoption. I did not want Nell growing up, feeling as if every compliment, every disagreement, every awkward relative, and every ordinary childhood correction had to be filtered through that one fact about how she came to us. That intention had a blind side I could not see yet. Dinner started well. My father made a toast that was shorter than usual, because my mother had warned him not to tell the story about their first apartment again. Diane smiled while pretending not to be pleased when Russell ignored the warning and mentioned the broken furnace anyway. Valerie corrected the year. Calvin ate with the patient expression of a man who had heard all three versions before. Rowan sat between her father and Nell. She was 17 then, 5 months from her 18th birthday, old enough that the adults had recently begun asking questions about college every time she entered a room. Rowan had always been quieter around her mother than she was around the rest of us, but I had never called it fear. She watched first. She answered carefully. Around Nell and Owen, some of that carefulness loosened. That evening, she had spent 10 minutes before dinner helping Nell decide whether Owen's new haircut made him look older or simply more aerodynamic. Owen had objected to both theories. Those were the things I saw. Other things were there too. When Mom realized 2 water glasses were missing, she glanced toward the kitchen and said she could have sworn she had set out enough. Nell was already standing before anyone asked. She collected 2 glasses, filled them, put one beside Owen and the other beside my father, then returned to her chair. Owen never stopped describing something that had happened at school. No one told him to. A few minutes later, Mom wanted the butter moved closer to Dad. Nell passed it. Valerie asked someone to bring the extra green beans from the counter. Nell rose again. Rowan started to stand that time too, but Valerie touched her forearm and reminded her that she had been complaining about being tired after studying late. Nell brought the beans. I noticed. That is important. I did not notice nothing. I saw my daughter getting up. I saw Owen staying seated. I saw Rowan being excused. What I failed to do was ask myself why. At the time, the answer I gave myself required almost no thought. Nell was helpful. She always had been. Valerie used whoever seemed competent. Rowan was older and busy with school. Owen was 10 and easily distracted. Small explanations slid into the spaces where better questions should have gone. Then Ben changed something. It was so minor that he probably forgot the moment before we reached home. The main dishes had begun moving around the table. Dad carved the roast while Mom passed vegetables. Nell waited with her plate almost empty, letting bowls travel past her. The mashed potatoes reached her, and she immediately angled the serving bowl toward my father instead. Ben, sitting beside her, stopped it gently with 2 fingers. He told her she didn't need to wait for everybody else to take what they wanted. If the food was in front of her, and she wanted some, she could serve herself. He didn't make a lesson out of it. He was already reaching for his water by the time Nell looked down at the bowl. I saw Rowan look up. Nell hesitated. Not dramatically, just long enough for the serving spoon to remain suspended above the potatoes while she checked the table. That tiny pause bothered me more in memory than it did when it happened. At the time, I smiled at her. She scooped potatoes onto her plate. Rowan's mouth curved at one corner. She reached toward the bowl as Nell began to set the spoon down. Valerie's chair moved. The sound came before I understood what she was doing. A sharp scrape of wood across hardwood, followed by the flat crack of her palm against Nell's face. For half a second, the table seemed to lose all depth. The wineglass near my father's hand trembled where his fingers had bumped it. Owen's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Ben turned so quickly, his knee struck the underside of the table. The serving spoon slipped from Nell's fingers. It hit the edge of her plate, bounced once, and spun against the china. Nell's hand went to her cheek. Valerie was standing over her. "Have you forgotten your place in this family?" It was not shouted. That made it worse. My sister's voice had the clipped, controlled quality she used when she believed a problem required immediate correction. Her breathing had quickened. but her face was composed except for a bright patch of color along her throat. Nell stared up at her. Then my daughter did something that hollowed out the center of my chest. She apologized. Not because anyone told her to. Not after an argument. Not after being confronted with some mistake. She had just been struck by a 44-year-old woman for putting mashed potatoes on her own plate, and her first instinct was to make the adult feel better. "I'm sorry." The words were barely louder than the spoon settling against the plate. I had begun pushing back my chair when my mother spoke. Diane had one hand resting beside her wineglass. Her expression held no shock, no confusion. She looked at Nell, as if Valerie had corrected poor table manners. Good. Adopted children need to be taught more carefully. Something in me became very still. Ben was already halfway out of his chair. Calvin had turned toward Valerie with an expression I could not yet read. My father's mouth had opened, though nothing came out. Rowan had not moved. Her hand was still extended toward the serving bowl, but she was not looking at Nell. She was looking at her mother. I would understand that later. In that moment, all I could see clearly was Nell. A red mark was beginning to bloom across her cheek. I set my fork down. The metal touched the plate with a small click that somehow sounded louder to me than everything else in the room. Then I stood, took Nell's hand, and looked at my sister. "You just lost everything." I did not know the full shape of everything yet. I knew only that Valerie had lost access to my daughter, and the benefit of having me explain away what I had just seen. Whatever came next would not be arranged around her comfort. Valerie started to respond. I never let the conversation become one of her meetings. I turned to Nell. Her fingers were cold in mine. Owen had slid down from his chair. His face had gone pale beneath the freckles across his nose, and he kept looking from Nell to Valerie as though the adults had suddenly begun behaving, according to rules nobody had taught him. I told him to get his coat. Ben gathered our things. Mom protested behind us. She said we were turning one terrible moment into something larger than it needed to be. Somewhere in the middle of it, she mentioned the anniversary, as if the date on the calendar could reduce the size of what had happened at the table. I could have stayed. That truth matters too. I could have stood there and demanded explanations. I could have forced Valerie to defend the slap in front of everybody. I could have turned my mother's words back on her and kept going until every person in that room chose a side. Part of me wanted to. Then Nell leaned against my arm. Her cheek was red. Her shoulders had folded inward. She was watching the adults instead of herself, measuring the room even after being hit. I chose the door. Dad finally found his voice as we crossed the foyer. He called my name, but not with the authority he had used when we were children. It sounded uncertain, almost pleading. I didn't stop. Outside, the November air had sharpened after sunset. Nell's breath fogged in front of her while Ben unlocked the car. Owen climbed into the back seat without arguing about where he sat, which may have been the first time in his life that happened voluntarily. Nell stood beside the open door. For a second, she looked back at my parents' house. Through the front window, the dining room glowed warm and yellow. From the driveway, nobody would have guessed anything had happened inside. The curtains were open. Candles still burned on the table. My mother's anniversary flowers sat in the middle of the room, normal from 20 feet away. I put a hand between Nell's shoulder blades. She got into the car. Ben drove. I sat in the passenger seat at first, because Nell said she was fine. 3 blocks later, I unbuckled, made Ben pull over, and moved into the back beside her. She had stopped touching her cheek. Instead, she held both hands clasped in her lap, thumbs rubbing against each other. Owen sat on the opposite side, unusually still. I took out my phone and used the dark screen as a mirror to look at the mark without making Nell feel examined. The redness spread from below her cheekbone toward her ear. No swelling, no broken skin. Her eye looked normal. Physical facts. Things I could count. Things that felt easier than the questions I did not yet know how to ask. Ben drove again. The heater hummed. Streetlights passed over Nell's face, in intervals light, shadow, light again. She watched them through the window. Then she asked, "Did I embarrass you?" I turned toward her. The question had been waiting somewhere inside her since the dining room. I could hear that now. She did not ask whether Valerie was allowed to hit her. She did not ask why Grandma had said what she said. She wanted to know whether putting food on her own plate had made me ashamed of her. I reached over and opened my hand on the seat between us. Nell looked at it for a moment before putting hers inside. No, I could have said more. I wanted to tell her she had done absolutely nothing wrong. I wanted to tell her I was furious with Valerie, furious with my mother, furious with myself, for every small moment that suddenly felt different in hindsight. But Nell's eyes had already dropped to our joined hands. That was not the moment to make her carry my explanation too. So I held on. Owen shifted beside her and pulled his jacket over his knees, even though the car was warm. He stared at the floor mats the rest of the way home. Ben drove with both hands locked around the wheel. At our house, normal habits failed one after another. Owen did not race upstairs. Nell did not remind him to hang his coat. Ben did not ask anyone to put shoes away. The four of us moved through the kitchen, as if we had entered someone else's home. Ben wrapped a cold pack in a dish towel and left it on the counter beside Nell, rather than pressing it on her. She picked it up after a minute and held it to her cheek. I photographed the redness once, with her permission, because some practical part of my brain had begun cataloging facts, even while the rest of me was still back at the table. Then I put the phone face down. Nell curled into the corner of the sofa with the cold pack. Owen sat close enough that their shoulders touched but did not speak. I went into the kitchen. The refrigerator clicked on. Ben followed me a minute later. He put both palms on the counter and bowed his head. The muscles along his jaw moved once. We did not need a long conversation to agree on the first thing that mattered. Valerie would not be around Nell. Everything beyond that could wait until morning. Police. My parents. What my mother had meant. Whether this had happened before. Why Nell had apologized. Those questions were already gathering, but my daughter needed one evening in which nobody demanded answers from her. My phone began lighting up anyway. Mom called first. I let it ring. Dad called 11 minutes later. Then Mom again. No message contained anything that mattered enough to make me answer. Ben muted the phone and placed it farther down the counter. I watched the screen go dark. 47 minutes after we had pulled away from my parents' house, Calvin's name appeared. That made me pick up. He rarely called me directly. I stepped into the mudroom so the kids would not have to hear another adult conversation circling the dinner. Wind brushed dry leaves along the driveway outside. Through the narrow window in the door, I could see the porch light catching them one at a time. Calvin sounded as though he were speaking from somewhere open. Cars moved behind him. A door slammed in the distance. He told me he was standing in a hotel parking lot with Rowan. Then, in pieces, he told me what had happened after we left. Rowan had refused to go home with Valerie. At first, everyone assumed she was reacting to what she had just seen. Diane told her not to make a second problem out of the first. Valerie instructed her to get her coat and stop being dramatic. Rowan did get her coat. Then she walked to Calvin instead. According to him, she did not shout. She did not accuse Valerie of anything in front of the room. She simply said she was not going back to their house with her mother that night. Calvin had spent years letting Valerie handle family conflict because she was better at it than he was. He admitted that to me, right there in the parking lot, although at the time I heard it only as background noise behind the more immediate fact. For once, he had not told Rowan to listen to her mother. He had taken his daughter's overnight bag from the hall closet and left with her. Before that happened, Dad tried to stop the evening from breaking apart. Calvin said Russell had done what he always did when tension rose, asked everyone to calm down, sit down, not turn one moment into a family disaster. Only nobody sat. Rowan would not. Calvin would not tell her to. Valerie kept insisting she was the only person behaving rationally. Then Dad looked at the chair Nell had left empty. Something changed. I did not see it happen. I know it only because Calvin told me. Russell stopped asking everyone else to stay. He asked Valerie to leave. Mom went with her. Not because Dad threw her out. Not because she had nowhere else to stand. Diane chose her. That hurt, but it did not surprise me anymore. The part that did surprise me was Rowan. Calvin said they had driven away with no plan except not to go home. He had booked a hotel for the night while sitting in the parking lot of a grocery store. Rowan was upstairs now, he told me, but she had made him promise he would not give Valerie the room number. He sounded ashamed when he told me that. Not ashamed of Rowan, ashamed that his daughter had asked. He said she did not feel safe going back to the house while Valerie was there. The word safe lodged somewhere beneath my ribs. I looked through the mudroom doorway. Nell was still on the sofa. The cold pack had slipped into her lap. Owen had turned on the television, with the volume almost all the way down, apparently deciding that silent cartoons were preferable to silence itself. I asked Calvin whether Rowan had said Valerie had hit her. He said no. I did not ask him to interrogate his daughter. I did not ask him for examples or dates or explanations. The dinner had already taught me what happened when adults made children prove discomfort quickly enough to satisfy them. Calvin said he only wanted me to know why he had left, and why Rowan would not be answering calls from Valerie that night. We ended the conversation without solving anything. When I returned to the living room, Nell had moved closer to Owen. The red mark on her cheek had faded slightly around the edges. I sat on the coffee table across from her. For the first time since dinner, the room was quiet enough that I could replay the moment without the sound of chairs moving and adults talking over one another. Nell reaching for the potatoes. Rowan reaching too. Valerie standing. The slap. Then something I had missed because I had been watching my daughter. Nell lifted her eyes to mine. Her forehead tightened. She had the expression she made when trying to remember whether she had left a library book at school. I waited. She moved the cold pack away from her cheek. Mom. Her fingers tightened around the towel. Aunt Valerie wasn't looking at me when she hit me. Nell swallowed. She was looking at Rowan. Nell's words stayed between us after she said them. I did not ask what she thought they meant. I did not ask her to reconstruct the angle of Valerie's face or the exact second her eyes moved. 12-year-olds should not have to become forensic analysts of the adults who hurt them just because the adults are desperate for explanations. I sat across from her until the cold pack warmed in her hands. Owen had fallen sideways against the sofa cushion, not asleep but close, his eyelids heavy from the long evening. Ben stood in the doorway to the kitchen, his arms folded across his chest. He had heard Nell's last sentence. None of us knew what to do with it yet. Eventually, I sent the kids upstairs. Nell asked whether Owen could sleep on the floor in her room. He pretended the suggestion was inconvenient, even as he carried his pillow down the hall before she finished asking. I let them. Ben and I stayed downstairs. The anniversary flowers were still on my mind. The candles. The untouched food. My mother's voice saying adopted children needed to be taught more carefully with the calm approval of someone commenting on table manners. But Nell's apology was worse. That was the piece I kept returning to. Not because she had apologized once after being frightened. Children sometimes say sorry when adults become angry around them. They want the pressure to stop. They reach for the fastest word they know. What disturbed me was how practiced it had sounded. There had been no confusion in her voice. No pause. Valerie hit her, and Nell immediately tried to repair the room. I slept badly. Around 2 a.m, I walked down the hall and found Owen's bedroom empty. Nell's door was open a few inches. Through the gap, I could see Owen wrapped in a blanket on the floor beside her bed, one leg sticking out at an angle. Nell was asleep facing the wall. The red mark on her cheek was mostly gone. That should have comforted me. It didn't. I stood there long enough for the hallway floor to become cold through my socks, then went back to bed. By breakfast, The house had begun pretending to be ordinary. Ben made eggs. Owen poured too much cereal into a bowl before remembering there were eggs and tried to convince everyone that eating both counted as fueling for growth. Nell appeared in an oversized sweatshirt with her hair pulled into a crooked ponytail. Her cheek showed only the faintest discoloration under the morning light. She checked my face before she sat down. I noticed that now. The quick glance. The calculation. Was Mom upset? Was breakfast safe? Should I say anything? I had probably seen that look before. The difference was that I finally stopped explaining it for her. I waited until she had eaten. Then I told her I wanted to ask about some things that happened at Grandma and Grandpa's house. Not whether Aunt Valerie was mean, not whether Grandma treated her badly. Those were adult labels. A child who had spent years adapting could easily say no to both and mean it. I asked what happened when somebody needed water. Nell shrugged and said she usually got it if she was nearby. Who cleared plates? She often did. Who helped Grandma carry food from the kitchen? Usually her, sometimes Rowan. What happened if she stayed seated? That question made her think longer. She twisted her spoon through the milk at the bottom of her cereal bowl. Finally, she said nothing terrible happened. Valerie might remind her that Grandma had been cooking all afternoon. Grandma might mention how nice it was to have a helpful girl in the family. Sometimes someone would tell Owen he was still little, or tell Rowan she needed to finish homework. No one had announced a rule. The expectation arrived through praise. Nell was helpful, mature, grateful. She had liked those compliments at first, which made the pattern harder to recognize. At Grandma's, approval followed the same behaviors again and again. Getting up first, letting someone else take the last role, noticing what adults needed before they asked. I asked what happened when Owen did not help. Nell glanced toward him. Owen was seated at the island with a piece of toast in one hand, listening so hard he had forgotten to eat it. "He's little," Nell said. Owen frowned. "I'm 10. There was something almost offended in his voice, as though being classified as little had become a personal attack now that it had been used as evidence. Nell looked at him. For the first time that morning, the corner of her mouth lifted. She said Aunt Valerie had always seemed to think Owen needed help finding things, while Nell was naturally good at it. Owen considered this, and defended himself by pointing out that Nell really was better at finding things. She reminded him that 2 days earlier he had stood in front of the open refrigerator and asked where the ketchup was. It was behind the milk. It was red. That was all. 2 sentences. Owen rolled his eyes. Nell smiled. Ben looked down at the pan he was washing so the kids would not see the relief on his face. The laugh did not fix anything. It was not supposed to. It simply reminded me that Nell was still 12. She could have a bruised memory from the night before and still enjoy proving her brother incapable of locating ketchup. I wanted more moments like that for her. I also began to understand how many ordinary moments I had misread. Nell told me about one Sunday dinner when she and Owen had both been playing a game in the den. Valerie called Nell to help bring dessert plates to the table. Owen stayed where he was. Nell had not thought much about it. I remembered the afternoon. I remembered calling into the den after Valerie asked for help. I had told Nell to go ahead and help her aunt. Not Owen. Nell. At the time, I had probably thought Nell was closer to the doorway. Maybe I thought she would do it without complaining. I could not remember my reasoning because I had not considered the decision important enough to remember. Nell had. That distinction sat heavily between us. There was another memory. A few months earlier, driving home from my parents' house, Nell had been unusually quiet. I had assumed she was tired. Eventually she had said Grandma was different with me. I remembered turning down the radio. I remembered asking what she meant. She had struggled to explain it. Grandma expected her to help more, she thought. Grandma talked about being grateful around her in ways she did not around Owen. I had told her Grandma was old-fashioned. The sentence returned to me with embarrassing clarity. Grandma is old-fashioned. A neat explanation. A harmless explanation. One that asked nothing more of me. I had not told Nell she was imagining it. I had not defended my mother aggressively or demanded that she stop criticizing family. I had done something quieter. I had accepted the interpretation that required the least examination. If my mother was simply old-fashioned, then I did not have to ask why old-fashioned seemed to land differently on my adopted daughter than on my biological son. I sat at the kitchen table, listening to Nell describe small moments I had previously stored in separate drawers. Grandma asked me to help. Aunt Valerie said I was mature. Owen was allowed to finish playing. Rowan had homework. I was already standing. None of them were dramatic enough to become a family crisis. Together, they looked different. Ben came to the table after he finished washing the pan. He did not try to make himself the parent who had seen everything clearly while I missed it. He admitted that he had noticed Nell often became quieter after visits with my family. He had assumed she was socially drained. That had seemed reasonable because Nell liked quiet after crowded rooms. At home, she sometimes disappeared with a book after birthday parties or school events. But Ben also remembered something I had forgotten completely. Late in the summer, Valerie had called both girls into the kitchen during a family cookout. Nell had started to object because she and Rowan were halfway through something outside. Rowan had leaned closer to her and muttered, "Just do it, it's easier." Ben heard the sentence. He thought it was teenage sarcasm. Now it sounded less funny. Nell did not remember what they had been asked to do. That was almost more disturbing. The task itself had not mattered enough to preserve. The rule had. Do it. It's easier. I looked at my daughter's hands resting on the table. Last night she had apologized after being hit. Maybe that response had not been born in 1 second. Maybe it had been rehearsed in smaller moments nobody had considered important. I had to be careful with that thought. There was a temptation, once you discover a pattern, to force every memory into it. Suddenly, every forgotten plate becomes evidence. Every uncomfortable silence becomes proof. Every family disagreement becomes part of the same design. I did not want to do that either. So I stopped asking Nell what things meant. I asked what happened, who said what, who stood, who stayed seated, what she did next. The facts could carry their own weight. By late morning, I knew enough to make the report I had already decided to make. The dinner had happened inside Fort Collins, at my parents' house. I called the non-emergency police number and explained that an adult family member had struck my 12-year-old daughter across the face the previous evening in front of multiple witnesses. The person who took the initial information did not gasp or promise immediate consequences. She asked for names, the address, when it happened, whether Nell needed medical care, and whether she was currently safe from Valerie. I gave her the facts. Nell had experienced pain. Her cheek had been visibly red for a while afterward. The mark was mostly gone that morning. We had taken one photograph the night before. There was no swelling, no eye injury, no loss of consciousness, no reason to turn a slap into a hospital scene it was not. But there had still been a slap. An adult had intentionally hit a child. I gave the names of everyone who had been at the table. Ben, Owen, Rowan, Calvin, my parents, Valerie. I also told them Valerie did not live with us and would not have access to Nell. Later that day, an officer took a fuller report. Notes, times, witness names, and a case number. No one promised a quick or dramatic result. The incident would be reviewed on the evidence, which was exactly what I wanted. Nell was not disappointed. She seemed relieved that nobody treated her like an emergency. When the officer needed information from her, he kept the questions focused on the actual incident. I watched Nell answer in the same plain language she had used at breakfast. She had taken food. Aunt Valerie slapped her. It hurt. Then Aunt Valerie said she had forgotten her place. My mother had said adopted children needed to be taught more carefully. There was something unbearable about hearing those sentences stripped of family context. At the dinner table, Valerie's voice had come wrapped in decades of history. Mom's approval had come wrapped in grandmotherhood, holidays, photographs, Christmas gifts, and rides home from school. On a police report, the facts lost their costumes. An adult struck a 12-year-old. Another adult approved. The simplicity made me wish I had seen other things simply sooner. After the officer left, Nell asked whether Valerie was going to jail. I told her I did not know what would happen and that none of it was her job to manage. She nodded. Then she asked if she could finish a science project. Children have a talent for walking out of emotional scenes adults would happily live inside for another 6 hours. She disappeared upstairs, carrying poster board. Owen followed 10 minutes later because he claimed she had stolen his best black marker. The house became noisy again. I was grateful for that. My phone was less cooperative. Mom had left 3 voicemails by noon. I did not listen to them yet. Dad sent one message asking me to call when I was ready. Valerie waited longer. Her message arrived a little after 2. I saw her name and almost deleted it without reading. Instead, I opened it once. She acknowledged that she had lost her temper. She said hitting Nell had been wrong. Then she spent the rest of the message separating that moment from everything around it. According to Valerie, I was taking one bad decision and turning it into evidence that she had mistreated Nell for years. She accused me of rewriting ordinary family expectations as discrimination because I was angry. One sentence sat near the end. One mistake does not get to rewrite my entire life. I read it twice. Not because I agreed, because I understood why the sentence would sound reasonable to people who had not been sitting where Nell sat. One mistake should not automatically redefine an entire person. But Valerie's message never asked what Nell had experienced. It focused on the threat to Valerie's identity. I still did not know whether the slap was isolated. That was precisely why I was no longer willing to accept her answer for me. I did not reply. Not because silence made me morally superior. I simply had nothing useful to say yet. An argument over text would not help Nell, and I had learned enough in 24 hours to distrust any conversation whose first purpose was deciding which adult got to feel innocent. Ben read the message after I handed him the phone. He returned it without commenting. His face had become still in the way it did when he was angry enough to know that speaking immediately would make things worse. That afternoon, we kept the house deliberately boring. Laundry, homework, a grocery list. Owen complained that we had no snacks, despite standing in front of a pantry containing enough food to survive a minor natural disaster. Nell worked at the dining table on a poster about water systems. At one point, she asked Ben whether a crooked label mattered. He told her the Colorado River would survive. She rolled her eyes. For 15 minutes, the previous night receded. Then Mom called again. I watched the phone vibrate against the counter. Nell noticed. Her pencil stopped and I turned the phone face down. She went back to coloring. By evening, Dad had left a voicemail. I listened to that one alone. Russell sounded exhausted. He did not excuse Valerie. He also did not condemn her cleanly. He said everyone had been upset, that the evening had gotten out of control, and that he wanted to understand what had happened before the family damaged itself beyond repair. The phrasing irritated me. The family damaged itself, as though damage were weather, as though a hand had not crossed a table and landed on my daughter's face. But Dad had also been the one who told Valerie to leave after I was gone. I did not yet know what to do with that contradiction. People rarely changed positions as cleanly as stories wanted them to. At 7, Calvin called. I took the phone into the back room and closed the door. He and Rowan had stayed at the hotel through the day. He had gone home once while Valerie was out to collect clothes and school things, then returned. By Monday, he said, he would need a more practical plan. A hotel was not a solution. His voice sounded different from the night before. Less stunned, more ashamed. He told me he had spent most of the day trying not to ask Rowan questions too quickly. That surprised me. Calvin had always been a practical man. Problems entered his world and immediately became logistics. Where do we stay? What does school need? Who needs to be called? Apparently, Rowan had made it clear that she was not ready to turn her fear into a checklist for him. So he waited. By late afternoon, she approached him. She did not ask him to call police. She did not ask him to divorce Valerie. She asked whether he believed she should have gone home with her mother after the dinner. Calvin told me he could not answer without hearing himself differently than he would have 24 hours earlier. A week earlier, he would have said Valerie was strict, Rowan was emotional, and families should not make permanent decisions during arguments. Now he had seen Valerie strike Nell over a serving spoon. He had seen his daughter watch it. He had seen Rowan refuse to go home. He told her he was not forcing her back that night. That was not the same as knowing what came next. Then Rowan asked to talk to me. Calvin made a point of saying he had not suggested it. He sounded almost defensive there, and I understood why. Valerie had already begun telling him that my influence was part of the problem. The last thing Calvin wanted was to appear as if he were handing his daughter to her aunt, because parenting had become uncomfortable. I told him I was willing to listen. Only listen. I did not promise to fix anything. That mattered to me. Although I was beginning to understand that what mattered more would be whether Rowan believed she could speak without having to manage the adults listening. Calvin went quiet for a few seconds. Then he told me there was one sentence Rowan had said earlier that afternoon that he could not stop hearing. She had been sitting on the edge of the hotel bed while he tried to organize clothes into drawers they would probably use for only a few nights. He had asked, carefully, why she had reacted to the slap before anyone else seemed to understand it. Rowan had looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Dad, do you want to know why I knew exactly what that slap meant?" Calvin had repeated Rowan's question to me the night before, but hearing them through a phone line and seeing the girl who had said them were two different things. I met them the next afternoon at the hotel, where they were still staying. Ben kept Nell and Owen home. We had decided the kids did not need to sit through another adult conversation while we tried to understand what had happened. Nell had already given enough of herself to the problem. The hotel was the kind built for people passing through town rather than living there. Everything looked designed to be temporary. Beige carpet, generic landscape prints, a coffee station that smelled faintly burned, chairs arranged near a gas fireplace nobody seemed to use. Calvin had chosen a table in a quiet corner of the lobby rather than bringing me upstairs to their room. I appreciated that. It gave Rowan space to leave without feeling trapped between a bed and a door. She had her backpack beside her chair, not the school bag Nell carried. Rowan's was heavier, crowded with notebooks and a laptop sleeve, one strap frayed near the top. I noticed it because she kept one foot hooked through the strap while she talked, as if the bag needed to remain physically attached to her. Calvin looked as though he had slept in his clothes. His beard had darkened along his jaw. He kept a paper cup between both hands without drinking from it. Whatever role he normally occupied in his marriage, the calm one, the practical one, the man who waited for Valerie to tell him what the family needed had disappeared. He had no replacement yet. Rowan looked tired too, but not fragile, and I kept that distinction in mind. She was 17, not a little girl sitting under a blanket waiting for adults to explain her own life to her. She knew more about her house than I did. More about her mother. More about what happened when doors closed and other people went home. So I did not begin by asking whether Valerie abused her. I did not ask whether she was afraid. I did not ask whether the slap had reminded her of being hit. I told her I was there to listen, and that if there was something she did not want to answer, she did not owe me an answer just because I was her aunt. Rowan nodded once. Then, unexpectedly, she began by telling me why her mother was good. She listed those things first. Valerie never missed a school meeting. She knew which teachers answered email quickly, and which needed follow-up. She remembered dentist appointments before the reminder texts arrived. She had driven Rowan through snow for a debate event when Calvin was out of town. When Rowan had the flu 2 winters earlier, Valerie slept in the chair outside her bedroom because Rowan kept waking nauseated and embarrassed. She knew how Rowan liked eggs. She knew which shampoo irritated her scalp. She kept backup chargers in the car because Rowan always forgot hers. As Rowan spoke, Calvin looked down at his cup. None of it sounded forced. That was the first important thing she gave me. There was no simple version of Valerie in which every act of care had secretly been control. My sister loved her daughter. She also frightened her. Those truths did not cancel each other. Rowan said the problem was not that her mother never cared what she wanted. The problem was that once Valerie believed she knew what was best, Rowan's preference stopped counting as information. That sentence sounded older than 17, but the examples she gave afterward were not abstract. If they argued and Rowan tried to leave the room, Valerie sometimes stood in the doorway. Not every time. Enough times that Rowan had learned not to walk toward the door too early. Sometimes Valerie would catch her arm or wrist if Rowan tried to move past her. Not hard enough to leave bruises, not with the wildness I might have imagined after seeing the slap. Valerie's grip was deliberate, functional. It meant the conversation was not over, because Valerie had not decided it was over. Other times, if Rowan reached for her car keys during an argument, Valerie took them first. The phone was similar. If Rowan walked away while still holding it, Valerie sometimes removed it from her hand or took it from the counter and kept it until she believed Rowan was calm enough to talk properly. Rowan did not describe these things as crimes. She described them as household facts. That made them harder to hear. A dramatic incident announces itself. A child knows to remember it. A pattern becomes furniture. You walk around it. I asked how long it had been happening. Rowan could not give me a clean beginning. Middle school maybe, earlier in smaller ways. The older Rowan became, the larger the choices became. What began with clothes and friends moved into curfews, driving, and decisions Valerie could not settle by keeping a phone for an evening. College. The word changed Rowan's posture before she said much else. She sat straighter. Not happier exactly. More present. A little over a week before the anniversary dinner, she had been accepted through rolling admission to an environmental design program at a public university on the Western Slope. The campus was roughly 5 hours from Fort Collins in good conditions, far enough that she would not be coming home because her mother disliked the tone of a text message. Rowan had wanted that program for more than a year. She liked how it combined design with the practical problem of how people lived inside landscapes, water, heat, shade, public space, buildings that had to exist in real places rather than on clean pages. She had shown me sketches before. I remembered a notebook filled with tiny courtyards, pathways, tree lines, and strange little boxes she said represented buildings. I had thought it was a hobby. Valerie had not. According to Rowan, her mother took the idea seriously enough to oppose it thoroughly. Valerie wanted her closer to home. A program in northern Colorado, something structured and, in Valerie's words, more practical. A route that left fewer unknowns. Valerie had never said Rowan could not attend the Western Slope School. She had done something more effective. She turned every discussion about it into a referendum on Rowan's judgment. Was Rowan mature enough to live that far away? Had she considered winter roads? What if she changed majors? Why pay for housing when good programs existed closer? Why was distance suddenly so important? Who had convinced her she needed to leave? Individually, none of those questions were absurd. That was what made the conflict difficult. A parent should ask whether a 17-year-old understands the cost and distance of college. A parent should care about safety. A parent should notice when a child's plans change. The problem was that Valerie did not use questions to gather information. She used them until Rowan became too tired to keep defending an answer. Calvin shifted in his chair when Rowan described that. He admitted he had been part of it. He worked in construction material sales and spent long days driving between clients, job sites, and regional offices. When he came home, Valerie usually already knew what was happening at school, what bill needed paying, what Rowan had agreed to, what deadline was coming. He had treated that competence like a division of labor. Parenting became something Valerie briefed him on. If Rowan complained that her mother would not let an argument end, he usually told her to finish the conversation. If she said Valerie was making college impossible, he told her they would all sit down when things were calmer. Calvin's face tightened when he said the word calmer. By then, I was beginning to understand what calm had meant in their house. It meant Valerie had reached agreement. Rowan had begun spending more time with us over the previous year. Not enough for me to call it remarkable. A Friday dinner here, an afternoon when she and Nell wanted to work on school projects together, a Saturday when Calvin dropped her off before heading to a client event. Sometimes she stayed late enough to eat with us. I had always assumed she liked being around the kids. She did. But that was not the whole reason. Rowan looked embarrassed when she explained it. Not ashamed of us. Embarrassed by how much ordinary things had impressed her. She remembered one evening when Ben came home late, and I had not planned dinner. Owen proposed cereal. Ben said cereal was breakfast. Owen argued that restaurants served breakfast at night, therefore society had already accepted breakfast foods as dinner. Nell sided with Owen because she wanted chocolate cereal and had no interest in principle. Ben eventually made grilled cheese. The entire disagreement lasted maybe 4 minutes. No one learned anything. No one won. Nobody's respect for anyone else was questioned. Rowan had been sitting at our counter watching it. She told me she kept waiting for the conversation to become serious. For Ben to tell Owen he was being disrespectful. For me to tell the kids that after everything their father did, they could at least be grateful for dinner. Instead, Owen ate 2 grilled cheese sandwiches and later complained that his cereal argument had been legally sound. Rowan laughed while she told me. It was the first time I had heard her laugh since the anniversary dinner. I remembered the night. What I remembered most was Ben telling Owen that citing imaginary case law did not improve his argument. At the time, Rowan's amusement had seemed disproportionate to something so stupid. Now I understood. She had not been laughing only because Owen was ridiculous. She was watching a disagreement remain small. That had felt unusual enough to entertain her. The realization was uncomfortable for reasons that had nothing to do with Valerie. I was part of this too, not in the same way. I had never blocked Rowan's door or taken her keys. I had never asked her to hide anything from her parents. I had never suggested she move in with us or choose a school because I preferred it. But she had been watching my house. She had used it as a comparison. Valerie's claim that I influenced her daughter was not invented from nothing. I said as much. Rowan looked surprised. She had probably expected me to defend myself. Instead, I told her. I could understand why her mother would notice that she had begun comparing households. That did not make every conclusion Valerie drew from it correct. But the influence itself was real. Rowan lowered her eyes to her backpack. She admitted she probably had idealized us. That word made me uneasy. Our house was not especially enlightened. Ben and I argued. I lost patience. Owen lied about brushing his teeth with such confidence that sometimes I almost admired the performance. Nell could go silent for half an hour when upset, and then insist nothing was wrong. I had already spent 2 days learning that a serious problem had existed close to me without my recognizing it. If Rowan had built our family into proof that another adult always knew what to do, then she was wrong about us too. But maybe she did not need a perfect family. Maybe she had needed evidence that a disagreement could end without someone surrendering their right to leave the room. That was a much lower standard, and somehow more devastating. Calvin asked whether Valerie had ever accused Rowan of wanting to be like Nell. Rowan's expression changed. She pressed her thumb along the frayed strap of her backpack. That was when Nell entered the story in a different way. Valerie had talked about my daughter more often than I knew. Sometimes critically, sometimes approvingly. That was what made the pattern slippery. When Nell helped without being asked, Valerie praised her. She would tell Rowan to notice how considerate Nell could be, how a child who had been through instability still understood the importance of contributing to a family. When Nell stayed quiet while adults talked, Valerie called her respectful. When she carried dishes, watched younger cousins for a few minutes, or offered to help my mother, Valerie used words like grateful and grounded. But when Nell chose differently, when she objected, asked for something first, or simply behaved with the casual entitlement of a child who believed she belonged, Valerie's language changed. Then, the problem was me. I gave kids too much choice. I treated every preference as important. I was teaching children to believe adults had to negotiate everything. Rowan had heard some variation of that for months. I asked whether Valerie had ever told Nell directly that she was influencing Rowan badly. Rowan said not in those words. I took that limit seriously. I did not want to turn implications into statements nobody had made. Valerie was subtler. She used comparison. She used approval. She used whichever version of Nell supported the lesson she wanted Rowan to learn. Helpful Nell was proof gratitude could be taught. Independent Nell was proof my parenting was too permissive. The child herself almost disappeared inside the argument. I thought back to the napkins, the green beans, and the water glasses. Maybe those moments had not only been chores, maybe Nell had also become an example. I kept that as a possibility rather than a fact. One conversation with Rowan could explain a pattern without explaining every dinner. The anniversary dinner had not started with mashed potatoes. Several days earlier, Valerie had been angry about college. Rowan told us the argument had happened in their kitchen. She had received the acceptance email in late October. Calvin was traveling overnight for work. Rowan showed her mother, expecting an argument about cost or distance. Valerie congratulated her first. That detail mattered to Rowan. Her mother had hugged her. She had even taken a picture of the acceptance screen. Then the questions began. By the end of the night, celebration had become interrogation. Why that campus? Why so far? Why environmental design instead of something with a clearer career path? Had Audrey suggested it? That last question had made Rowan angry. I had not. I did not even know she had applied. But Rowan had answered carelessly. She said maybe she wanted to be around people who did not think every choice needed family approval. Valerie heard my household inside that sentence, even though my name was not there. The argument continued until Rowan tried to go upstairs. Valerie stood near the stairs and told her they were not finished. Rowan did not try to push past. She stayed. They talked until almost midnight. When Calvin returned the next day, Valerie summarized the disagreement as a teenager becoming defensive about college. Calvin accepted the summary. Rowan let him. That part struck him hardest. He had not been lied to exactly. He had been given one interpretation, and because it came from the person who handled everything, he never asked for another. A few days later, Valerie called Diane. I did not know that yet. That piece would come later. What Rowan did know was that her mother became increasingly irritated whenever she mentioned our house, especially Nell. 2 nights before the anniversary dinner, Rowan and Valerie argued again because Rowan wanted to attend an admitted student event in the spring. Valerie accused her of treating every limit as control. Then, according to Rowan, Valerie said something that had sounded minor at the time. She told Rowan to watch how Nell behaved at Grandma's dinner. Not because Nell was adopted, not explicitly. Because, Valerie said, Audrey had been filling both girls' heads with the idea that every preference deserved equal weight. Rowan had rolled her eyes. She thought her mother was making a ridiculous comparison. At the anniversary dinner, she forgot the conversation until Nell reached for the mashed potatoes. I could see the memory rearranging itself while Rowan spoke. Nell had waited. Ben told her she did not need to. Nell served herself. Rowan saw it. Not rebellion, not disrespect. A 12-year-old putting food on a plate. And because she was 17, and tired of letting every small choice become a test of loyalty. Rowan reached for the spoon too. That was the movement Valerie saw. I went back to the dinner in my head. Nell's hand lowering the spoon, Rowan's hand extending, Valerie's chair scraping backward. The slap had always seemed impossibly disproportionate to what Nell had done. Maybe that was because Nell's action was only half the event Valerie was reacting to. Calvin leaned back in his chair. His paper cup had collapsed slightly where his fingers had been squeezing it. He asked Rowan if she believed Valerie had planned to hit Nell. Rowan shook her head immediately. No, that was not what she meant. There had been no scheme, no threat beforehand, no plan to create a scene at Grandma's anniversary dinner. Valeria lost control, but at a specific moment, and Rowan knew the difference. Rowan said she knew her mother's face when an argument stopped being about the immediate subject and became about authority. She had seen it over curfews and car keys, clothes, and college. At dinner, she saw it when both girls reached for the same spoon. Valerie had spent months insisting that choice without permission became selfishness. Then Nell acted like she did not need permission. Rowan copied her. For 1 second, the hierarchy Valerie trusted disappeared in front of everyone. The slap put it back. At least, that was how Rowan understood it. I looked at my niece. Her eyes were dry. Her hands were not. She had rubbed the strap of her backpack so hard that the skin around her thumb had gone pink. I wanted to tell her what happened next was not her fault. I wanted to tell her Valerie would have been wrong no matter what Rowan did. Neither reassurance was the thing Rowan needed to say. So I waited. The hotel lobby continued around us. An ice machine hummed beyond the hallway. Someone rolled a suitcase across the tile near the entrance. A television mounted above the fireplace showed a football recap with the sound off. Ordinary life kept moving, while a girl I had known since birth rearranged everything I thought I understood about my sister. Rowan finally looked at me, then at Calvin. Her voice was quieter than it had been all afternoon. Mom didn't hit Nell because Nell forgot her place. She stopped rubbing the backpack strap. She hit her because she thought I was starting to forget mine. Rowan's words followed me home. Not like a revelation that solved anything, more like a loose thread I could not stop feeling between my fingers. By the time I pulled into our driveway, dusk had settled over Fort Collins, and the porch light had come on automatically. Through the front window, I could see Nell at the kitchen table with a pencil tucked behind one ear. Owen was beside her, apparently trying to build something out of cereal box cardboard that required more tape than physics. For several seconds, I stayed in the car. The hotel conversation had rearranged Valerie in my mind. Not redeemed her. Not softened the shape of what she had done, but rearranged her. The woman who had slapped my daughter was also the woman Rowan described as carrying spare chargers, remembering every appointment, sleeping outside her bedroom when she was sick. The woman who blocked doorways had once been the sister who checked my homework before Mom did. Those things could exist in the same person. I did not yet know what to do with that. Inside, Ben had started dinner. Nothing elaborate. Pasta, jarred sauce, a salad, Owen had declared. Structurally unnecessary. Nell had already set out plates. I stopped when I saw her carrying the forks. Not because a 12-year-old helping set the table was alarming, because she had done it before anyone asked. That distinction mattered now. She moved around the kitchen with the same efficient little rhythm she had used at my parents' house. Plates first, forks, water glasses, napkins. Ben was stirring sauce. Owen was looking for grated cheese. Nell reached for the serving bowl. I told her she could sit down. She looked at me as if I had interrupted her halfway through tying a shoe. I'm helping. I knew. That was the problem. Not helping itself. The assumption that she should always be the one to notice first. I told her we all lived there. She could put away whatever she had used and leave the rest for the rest of us. Nell stared at the forks in her hand. Then she set them down on the counter and sat. For a few seconds, she looked almost guilty, Owen noticed the abandoned forks and complained because he had already been assigned salad duty. Ben told him the household had survived revolutions greater than silverware distribution. Owen dragged himself toward the drawer, as if we had sentenced him to hard labor. Nell smiled. It was small. Still, it reminded me why I had to be careful with everything that came next. I could spend months trying to understand Valerie. Nell was the one who had been hit. That fact had to stay in the center, even when I started looking backward. The first real conversation with my mother happened 2 days later. I had avoided her calls until I knew I could hear her without turning the conversation into punishment. That did not mean I wanted reconciliation. It meant I wanted information. Mom asked to come to my house. I said no. Nell lived there, and that was reason enough. We met instead at a quiet coffee shop near Old Town, mid-morning on a weekday when most of the tables were empty. Mom arrived early, of course. She had already chosen a table against the wall and placed her purse on the chair beside her like she wanted to control even the geometry of the conversation. She looked older than she had at the anniversary dinner. Not dramatically, just tired. The lines around her mouth seemed deeper. Her hair, usually arranged with careful volume, had flattened on one side as though she had slept badly and not had the energy to fix it. For 1 second, seeing her like that made something old in me want to reduce the conflict. Then I remembered Nell asking whether she had embarrassed me. I sat down. Mom did not deny what she had said. That surprised me. She did not claim I had misunderstood. She did not tell me the room was loud, or she had been shocked. She admitted Valerie should not have slapped Nell. Then she separated the slap from the belief beneath it. In Diane's version, Valerie had crossed a line because physical punishment was not her place. But the principle had been sound. Children should help older relatives. They should wait their turn. They should not grow up believing every impulse deserved immediate satisfaction. And Nell, Mom said, needed those lessons with special care. She did not use the word less. She used the word careful. That word allowed her to believe she was being responsible. Mom reminded me that Nell had joined our family at 7, after years of instability she did not create. In Diane's mind, that history meant Nell needed extra structure, extra reminders, extra emphasis on gratitude. As if gratitude were a corrective treatment. As if belonging came with maintenance instructions. I listened longer than I expected, not because I agreed, because I finally understood that my mother had not applauded the slap out of temporary anger. She had applauded the hierarchy. The violence had been too much. The lesson, to her, had not been. That distinction was worse than a moment of bad judgment. It meant an apology for the slap alone would change almost nothing. Mom asked when she could see Nell. I told her I did not know. Her fingers tightened around the paper sleeve on her coffee cup. She said she had been Nell's grandmother for years. I did not argue with the title. Titles were not the question anymore. Before we left, Mom told me I was turning one terrible mistake into a judgment on the entire family. I did not answer. Not because she was entirely wrong. I was looking at the entire family now. I just had not decided what I would find. Dad called that afternoon. He had not come to the coffee shop. Mom had wanted him there, but he refused to join what he called another round of women arguing about the same thing. That phrase told me more than he intended. I went to see him alone. My parents' house looked almost unchanged from the night of the anniversary. The formal dining room had been cleaned. The linens were gone. The candles had disappeared. Only a faint wax mark remained near the center of the table where one candle had dripped. The chair Nell had used was pushed neatly into place. Dad stood in the kitchen rinsing a mug when I walked in. He did not hug me. I did not expect him to. Russell had always loved through tasks, more easily than through confrontation. He could change a tire at midnight, drive across town to pick up a sick grandchild, repair a broken stair before anyone asked. But emotional conflict made him behave as though a fire alarm had gone off in a room he did not know how to exit. He told me he hated what Valerie had done. Then he immediately began talking about how families survived bad nights. He said people lost control. People said things they regretted. He reminded me that he had asked Valerie to leave after I was gone. I let him finish. Then, I asked him something simple. If a stranger in a restaurant had slapped Nell because she served herself first, would he tell me not to let one terrible moment destroy the relationship? Dad looked at the mug in his hands. His thumb moved along the handle. He did not answer. The silence was more useful than anything else he could have said. I walked into the dining room. The table was empty. Without people around it, it looked smaller. I rested my hand on the back of Nell's chair. Dad stayed in the doorway. For years, whenever my mother and Valerie clashed with someone, Dad had called it women's stuff. He said it like neutrality. What it really meant was he did not plan to enter. That left the person most willing to take control in charge of the outcome. Most of the time, that person had been Valerie. I asked him when that started. He frowned. I clarified. When did Valerie become the person who managed everybody? Dad's first reaction was to say she had always been like that. The sentence arrived too easily. Always organized. Always responsible. Always mature. I had heard those words my whole life. So had Valerie. I drove home thinking about them. Always responsible. That night, after Nell and Owen were asleep, I opened an old plastic storage bin in the hallway closet. It held the kind of family debris nobody throws away, because each object is too unimportant to deserve a decision. School pictures, birthday cards, a dance recital program, a stack of photos Mom had given me when she downsized albums a few years earlier. I sat on the floor and went through them. Valerie at 16, standing behind me with both hands on my shoulders. Valerie at 14, holding a grocery bag in one arm and my winter coat in the other. Valerie at 12, kneeling beside a birthday cake, while I leaned too close to the candles. In every picture, I looked like a child. Valerie looked like someone already watching the room. That was probably unfair. Photographs freeze posture, not motive. Still, one picture made me laugh. I had forgotten it existed. I was 13, Valerie was 17. My hair ended somewhere between my jaw and my shoulders, in a shape no licensed professional would have claimed responsibility for. Valerie had cut it. The disaster began because I wanted bangs. Mom had said no. Valerie decided she could do them herself. She could not. One side ended nearly an inch shorter than the other, and when she tried to fix it, she made the shorter side worse. By the time we understood the scale of the problem, half my hair looked as though it had been chewed. We spent the next weekend wearing baseball caps inside the house. Mom noticed immediately, of course. But before she did, Valerie and I had laughed so hard in the bathroom that I had to sit on the floor. I remembered her sliding down the cabinet beside me, scissors still in her hand, both of us trying not to make noise. That was my sister too, not the woman standing over Nell. A 17-year-old girl who had made a terrible haircut worse, because she was trying to protect her little sister from being yelled at for the first terrible haircut. The memory loosened something in me. Then another memory followed. Valerie making dinner when Mom had a migraine. Valerie checking the mail because Dad forgot. Valerie signing my school planner when Mom was working late, though she technically was not supposed to. Valerie waiting outside the principal's office after I got into trouble in 7th grade. Valerie telling me what version of the story to give Mom so the argument would not last all night. The memories did not arrive as abuse. They arrived as care. That was the problem. When Valerie was 11 and I was 7, Mom began trusting her with small things. Watch Audrey for 20 minutes. Make sure she does her homework. Tell her not to leave the yard. Nothing shocking. By the time Valerie was 13, the tasks had grown. Warm up dinner if Dad was late. Keep me quiet if Mom had a headache. Remember which day I needed gym clothes. Call Dad if the furnace made that sound again. At 15, Valerie knew more about household logistics than many adults. At 17, She could read Mom's mood from the way a cabinet closed. She could tell me when to stay upstairs, when to apologize, when to stop asking, when to say nothing. I had called that wisdom. Maybe it was. Wisdom learned too early. The next time I saw Dad, I brought one of the photos, not as evidence. I did not need to prove our childhood happened. I wanted him to look at Valerie's age, 17 in the haircut picture. Still a child. Dad smiled when he saw it. Then his face changed. I asked whether he remembered who had fixed dinner most nights that spring. He said Mom had been working more then. I asked who helped me with homework. He said Valerie usually did. Who got me ready when Mom had migraines? Valerie. Who kept track of the permission slips when Dad was traveling for work? Valerie. The list became uncomfortable before it became long. Dad sat back in his chair. For the first time, he did not defend himself by saying families helped each other. He said something smaller. He said Valerie had been good at it. That was why they let her do more. I looked at him. He understood the problem before I said anything. The reward for being good at carrying too much had been more weight. Dad rubbed one hand over his mouth. He admitted that the house ran more smoothly when Valerie took charge. Mom worried less. I complained less because my sister knew how to redirect me. Dad came home to fewer problems. They praised Valerie for maturity because the alternative would have required admitting how convenient her maturity was. That was the first time my father stopped describing his silence as ignorance. He had known she did too much. Not in the language we would use now. He had not looked at his teenage daughter and thought, "We are parentifying her." He had simply enjoyed the result. I did too. That was the part I had to let stand. I had been a child and had not created the system, yet I had benefited from it. While Valerie was learning which mood Mom was in, I was allowed to remain more careless. While Valerie remembered deadlines, I forgot them. While she learned how to make conflict disappear, I learned there was usually someone else in the house who would help me escape it. Some of the freedom I later treated as a personality difference between us had been purchased with responsibilities she carried. I did not need to blame my 13-year-old self. I did need to stop pretending I had never benefited. That evening, I sat beside Nell while she worked on math homework. She had reached the age where she preferred me nearby, but did not want me looking directly at the page unless invited. I watched her erase the same answer twice. Then she reached for my empty water glass. I covered it with my hand. She looked at me. I told her I could get it. Nell shrugged and went back to her worksheet. No breakthrough, no speech. The moment passed. That was exactly what I wanted. A week earlier, I might have allowed her to get the water because she was already standing. Now I noticed how easy it was to turn a willing child into the person everybody expected to move first. Mom called again the next morning. Her tone had changed. Less defensive, not softer, more tired. She said Dad had been dredging up old stories and making everything sound worse than it had been. I asked which stories. That was when she told me about the call from Valerie before the anniversary dinner. She had not considered it important. Valerie had called several days earlier because Rowan had been accepted to the school on the western slope and would not stop talking about leaving. Mom had listened while Valerie complained that Rowan was becoming difficult about every decision. The school, the distance, the idea that parents did not get final say just because they were parents. Valerie had apparently mentioned my house more than once. My name, Ben's, Nell's. Mom said Valerie believed Rowan was absorbing the idea that families had to reorganize themselves around whatever a child wanted in the moment. That was Diane's version. I asked what she told Valerie. Mom hesitated. Not long. Just enough. Then she said she told her oldest daughter to be firmer. Teenagers needed parents, not friends. If Valerie kept negotiating every boundary, Rowan would assume persistence meant she could outlast the rule. Mom said she had told Valerie not to let a 17-year-old run the family. The words landed quietly. No order to hit Nell. No secret plan. No conspiracy, just one generation reinforcing the next. Be firmer. Do not let her run the family. Valerie had carried that advice into the anniversary dinner. A few days later, Rowan reached for the same serving spoon as Nell, and my sister reacted as though two girls choosing for themselves were not two small actions. They were a breach. I asked Mom whether she regretted what she had said. She answered too quickly. She regretted the slap, not the advice. That told me where we still stood. After the call, I kept seeing two 17-year-old girls, Valerie in our bathroom trying to protect me from Mom's anger, and Rowan in a hotel because she did not trust her mother to let a conflict end. The past did not excuse what Valerie chose later, but it showed me the soil. Our family had rewarded the person who prevented disorder until usefulness began to look like authority. Nell's adoption gave that old rule a cruel new pressure point. Gratitude could be demanded from the child who had joined us later. Valerie's question at dinner, "Have you forgotten your place?" had not appeared from nowhere. What frightened me was how many of us had helped build the idea behind it. Once I saw that, the past did not become simpler. It became less comfortable. For the first few days after my conversation with Mom, I saw the same hierarchy beyond adoption. In my parents' house, women noticed the empty coffee, girls cleared dishes first, and Valerie had inherited much of that invisible labor before she could drive. Habits like those were not automatically abusive, but they became different when one person was praised for carrying them and another was barely expected to notice. At the anniversary dinner, Owen had remained seated while Nell moved. Adoption had not created that structure. It had made the moral cost of refusing it heavier for Nell. I saw it most clearly one Saturday morning, when Owen complained about unloading the dishwasher. He had been assigned the bottom rack because Nell had already put away everything on top. He dragged himself into the kitchen with such theatrical misery that Ben asked whether the plates had personally offended him. Owen muttered something about child labor. Normally, I would have laughed and told him to finish. Instead, I watched Nell. She was already reaching toward the silverware basket. No one had asked. I stopped her. Owen looked between us, confused. I told him his sister had finished her part. His expression changed slowly. He took the silverware basket. There was no dramatic apology. He did not suddenly understand generational inequality. He was 10. He put spoons in the wrong slots, complained that forks had too many categories, and finished the job. Later, though, he came into my office while I was working. He stood beside my desk long enough that I finally looked up. He wanted to know whether Aunt Valerie always made Nell help more. I told him I did not know if always was fair. He frowned at that. Then he admitted something I had not expected. There had been times at Grandma's when he knew Nell would be called before him. Not because anyone said it. He just knew. Once, when the two of them were playing outside, he had heard Valerie call for help setting the table. Owen stayed where he was because, as he put it, Valerie had said girls first. Nell went inside. He had not thought about it afterward. His face tightened as he told me. I could see guilt trying to grow too large for him. I did not let it. The adults had built the expectation. A 10-year-old benefiting from it did not make him responsible for designing it, but I also did not tell him he had done nothing. He had noticed. Next time, noticing could lead to a different choice. That was enough responsibility for a boy his age. He left my office and went looking for Nell. A few minutes later, I heard them arguing over whose turn it was to choose what to watch. I smiled despite myself. Nell did not surrender the remote. That mattered more to me than whatever apology Owen might have attempted. Rowan's problem looked similar from far away and completely different up close. That was another mistake I had almost made. At first, after the slap, it was easy to see both girls as victims of Valerie's belief about obedience. They were. But the fear inside them did not grow from the same place. Nell knew she belonged in our home. She did not wake up afraid Ben and I might give her back. She did not secretly believe adoption made our love temporary. Her wound lived at the edges of the family, where belonging had always seemed slightly conditional on being easy to have around. With Rowan, the wound came from the opposite direction. She had never doubted that Valerie considered her family. Valerie's love was everywhere, in schedules, in reminders, in rules, in packed lunches and weather alerts, and questions about where Rowan was going and when she would return. Rowan's fear was not that her mother would stop claiming her. It was that love might become accusation the moment she chose a life her mother did not approve of. A bad daughter, selfish, ungrateful, influenced, difficult. That distinction changed how I talked to them. With Nell, I had to stop asking her to earn ease for the adults around her. With Rowan, I had to be careful not to turn freedom into another set of instructions. That second task was harder than I expected. Valerie made sure of it. She called me near the end of November. I almost let the call go to voicemail. Then I answered, because too much of our family had already been conducted through people speaking for other people. If my sister wanted to tell me what she believed, I wanted to hear it from her. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. It did not become a screaming match. Valerie was too controlled for that, and by then, I had stopped believing volume was the measure of danger. She told me I had taken one physical mistake and used it to challenge every relationship she had. She knew police had been contacted. She knew I was not allowing her near Nell. She did not like either decision, but those were not the things that made her voice tighten. Rowan did. Valerie believed I had become the place her daughter went whenever she wanted validation against her mother. She said Rowan had spent months comparing our house to hers. At my house, children could walk away from an argument. At my house, teenagers could disagree without consequences. At my house, every preference became something adults were expected to negotiate. Valerie's version was distorted, but not invented. I had already heard Rowan admit she idealized us. So, when Valerie said, "You've made yourself the answer every time she doesn't like mine," I did not have the satisfaction of dismissing the sentence. It landed. She was wrong to treat Rowan's independence as disobedience. She was wrong to hit Nell. She was wrong to use my daughter's adoption as a lesson in gratitude. But I did have influence. Pretending otherwise would have been another version of choosing the explanation that made me most comfortable. Valerie went further. She said I had the easiest role in the family. I could listen to Rowan's complaints and send her home. I could be relaxed because I did not have to carry the consequence of every decision Rowan made. If she skipped class, failed a course, wrecked a car, chose the wrong program, got sick 5 hours away, or needed money at midnight, Valerie would still be the mother expected to handle it. There was truth inside that too. Parenthood gave me no special immunity from hypocrisy. I had worried about Owen crossing the street alone while lecturing my sister about control. I had checked Nell's location on her phone when she was late from a school activity. Boundaries were not inherently wrong. Teenagers did need parents willing to say no. That was precisely why Valerie's strongest arguments were dangerous. They began in reasonable territory. They crossed the line when she treated disagreement as evidence that the child had forfeited the right to end the conversation. I listened. I did not rescue myself with a speech about how different we were. When Valerie finished, I told her only that I would not discuss Rowan behind Rowan's back, as if she were a problem the adults could divide between them. My sister took that as proof I had chosen sides. Maybe I had, just not in the way she meant. I had chosen the side where a 17-year-old remained a person, even when adults disagreed about her choices. After the call, I sat in my car outside my office for almost 20 minutes. My hands stayed on the steering wheel, though the engine was off. The late November light had already started fading. Frost edged the shadowed corners of the parking lot. A delivery truck idled near the building across from mine, its reverse alarm sounding every few seconds. Valerie's words replayed without my permission. "You've made yourself the answer." Had I? I thought about every conversation with Rowan over the previous year. Had I encouraged the Western Slope school? No. Had I told her she should leave home? No. Had I criticized Valerie's parenting in front of her before the slap? Not that I could remember. Those facts were reassuring. They were also too easy. The better question was not whether I had deliberately influenced her. The better question was what role I was becoming now. Rowan had already spent years learning that one adult's voice could dominate a room. The solution could not be replacing Valerie's voice with mine. I had to ask myself something I did not like asking. Was I helping Rowan find her own voice? Or was I making it easier for her to borrow mine? The distinction sounded obvious. Living it was not. Aunt, mother, safe adult, witness, sister. Those roles could overlap badly if I let them. That evening, I called Calvin. By then, he and Rowan were no longer trying to treat a hotel as temporary housing. Calvin had found a furnished month-to-month apartment in Windsor, close enough that Rowan could keep attending the same high school without turning each morning into a commute across northern Colorado. He was still sleeping badly. I could hear it in his voice. Moving out had not converted him into a man certain of every decision. If anything, distance from Valerie had removed the person who usually told him which decision was correct. He admitted something that surprised me. He was worried about me too, not afraid of me. Worried about the dynamic. He had watched Rowan turn to me after the dinner. He had heard her compare our house to theirs. He had also heard Valerie accuse me of undermining her for months. He did not believe Valerie's entire story, but he could not simply declare me uninvolved. I appreciated him more for saying it. There would have been something unreal about Calvin going from 20 years of letting Valerie define family problems to instantly accepting my version of everything. He needed to question me too. I told him he should. Then I told him what I had decided. I would listen to Rowan. I would not choose her college. I would not tell her whether to reconcile with Valerie. I would not become the adult who told her what outcome proved she was strong. If she asked me what I thought about a specific behavior, I would answer honestly. But her future belonged to her. With Calvin carrying the responsibilities that were actually his while she was still a minor. Calvin was quiet for a while. Then he said that sounded reasonable. The word almost made me laugh. Reasonable had become such a loaded family term. The next time Rowan called, I tried to follow the boundary. She wanted to talk about college. Previously, I might have told her what I knew about living away from home, how valuable independence could be, what I thought of the program. Instead, I asked what she liked about the school and what worried her. She had plenty of both. The program fit what she wanted. The distance frightened her more than she admitted to Valerie. She was worried about mountain driving. She was worried about tuition, even with partial merit aid, and the education savings Calvin and Valerie had built. She was worried she would arrive and discover that she had wanted the school, mostly because her mother opposed it. That last fear was the most important. It belonged to Rowan, not to Valerie, not to me. I told her I thought that was a question worth taking seriously. Then I stopped. No recommendation, no inspirational line about escaping, no suggestion that choosing the far school would prove anything. It felt almost unnaturally restrained. I understood a little better why control could masquerade as care. When you love someone and believe you see the danger clearly, giving advice feels like helping. Stopping feels negligent, but sometimes silence leaves room for another person to hear themselves. Rowan eventually said she still wanted to visit the campus before making a final commitment. That sounded like her decision. I left it there. At home, Nell was changing in smaller ways. One evening, Mom sent her a message through the family group chat, asking whether she wanted to help bake at Christmas. The old Nell would probably have answered yes, before deciding whether she wanted to. This time, she brought the phone to me. Not because she wanted me to refuse for her. She wanted to know if she was allowed to say no. The question hurt in a way I had stopped being surprised by. I told her yes. She stared at the screen for another minute, then typed something short. She did not want to bake. No explanation, no apology. She put the phone down. 5 minutes later, she was arguing with Owen over a charger. Healing did not announce itself. Sometimes it looked like a child sending a 2-word answer and then forgetting about it. Not everyone in the family saw those changes the same way. Mom considered them evidence that I was encouraging disrespect. Dad had stopped repeating that phrase, though he still wanted the family to get through this without fully understanding what getting through it would require. Ben supported me, but he also challenged me when I started using Valerie as a reference point for every parenting choice. More than once, he reminded me that doing the opposite of Valerie was not the same as thinking carefully. He was right. A family could be controlled by rebellion almost as easily as by obedience if every decision existed only in reaction to one person. Calvin was still the most uncertain. He loved Valerie. That did not disappear because he moved into an apartment. He missed their routines. He missed the way she knew what needed doing before he asked. He missed the shared shorthand of 19 years. Rowan missed parts of her mother too. That was important. She missed Valerie's cooking. She missed hearing her mother move around the kitchen early in the morning. She missed sending her pictures of ugly clothes from stores just to get a reaction. She did not miss having the end of every disagreement decided for her. Both realities lived side by side. That was why Calvin's next conversation with Valerie mattered. He told me about it afterward. They met without Rowan at a quiet restaurant near Windsor. Calvin did not go in promising separation or reconciliation. He wanted to know whether Valerie could imagine returning to the house under different rules. No blocking doorways. No taking keys to prevent a conversation from ending. No physical contact during conflict. No using Nell or my household as examples of what Rowan should or should not become. Valerie heard the conditions as an accusation. She told Calvin he was rewarding Rowan for refusing to come home. In Valerie's mind, Rowan had learned something dangerous from the aftermath of the slap, that if she resisted hard enough, adults would rearrange themselves around her. Calvin tried to explain that letting a 17-year-old leave a heated room was not the same as giving her authority over the family. Valerie disagreed. She wanted Rowan back home before any larger conversation about college or counseling. Calvin asked whether Valerie would agree that Rowan could end an argument by leaving the room and return to it later. Valerie would not give him a clean answer. She kept returning to respect, to parental authority, to the danger of teaching a teenager that discomfort meant she could walk away. Calvin told me he almost agreed with her. That admission mattered. He could imagine a version of the problem where Rowan had become entitled, where a teenager weaponized language about boundaries to avoid ordinary responsibility. Parents did have to finish difficult conversations. Children did not get to leave school because a teacher irritated them or abandon every obligation that felt uncomfortable. For several minutes, he wondered whether he had overcorrected after seeing the slap. Then he remembered the hotel. Not the room, not the bags. The question Rowan had asked before agreeing to sleep there, whether he would tell Valerie the room number. A teenager who merely wanted freedom from rules did not need to know whether her mother could find the building. Calvin looked at the woman he had married and asked what she believed he was rewarding. Valerie said disobedience. That word changed something. He had heard it from her before, probably dozens of times in different forms. But now the system around it was visible. Nell serving herself. Rowan reaching for the spoon. The slap, the doorway, the keys, the hotel, all of it connected by the same assumption. Valerie believed a good family was one in which the person with authority could secure compliance. Calvin did not tell her the marriage was over. He was not there yet. He did not threaten court. He did not give her an ultimatum. He told her he and Rowan would not move home, simply to recreate the same structure and hope everyone behaved better next time. If they were going to return, something had to change before the return, not because of it. Valerie accused him of letting a 17-year-old break their family. Calvin sat with that accusation. For years, he had treated keeping the family together as proof that the family was functioning. Now he was beginning to ask a different question. Together for what, and at whose cost? When he told me about the conversation later, I could hear how much he still wanted Valerie to give him another answer. Not an apology designed to bring everyone home, an answer that showed she understood the problem. She had not given him one. The last thing she said before leaving the restaurant was the sentence he kept returning to. "You're rewarding her for disobeying me." Calvin had watched her walk away, then sat alone with the check between his hands. He told me the sentence had sounded different this time. Not because Valerie had changed the word, because, for the first time, he had finally heard it. The word Calvin had finally heard was disobeying. Once he said it to me, I began hearing variations of it everywhere, not always from Valerie. Sometimes from children, sometimes from myself. A few days after Calvin's restaurant conversation with my sister, I found Nell standing at the kitchen counter before school, packing Owen's lunch. She had already made her own. Ben had gone upstairs to look for a missing permission slip. I was answering an email on my phone. Owen was somewhere near the front hall, loudly insisting he had put both shoes in the same general area, which was apparently his legal definition of responsibility. No one had asked Nell to pack anything. She simply saw the open lunchbox and began. There was nothing wrong with the act itself. That was what made all of this so difficult. A helpful child could still be helpful. The solution was not to make generosity suspicious. I put my phone down and asked Owen to finish his own lunch. He appeared in the kitchen wearing one sneaker and one sock. Nell immediately moved as if she were going to hand him the sandwich. I stopped her with a light touch on the counter. Owen stared at the sandwich as though I had just transferred ownership of a small business. He finished packing it. Nell stood there for a moment with her hands empty. Then she asked if she could put the chips in, because she was already standing there. I told her she could if she wanted to. The difference between wanted and should was tiny enough to disappear inside a sentence. I watched her think about it. She put the chips in. That was fine. The goal was not to teach her never to help. The goal was to give the choice back. That evening, the choice frightened her. We had eaten dinner. Ben was loading the dishwasher, while Owen argued that rinsing plates before putting them inside defeated the entire philosophical purpose of owning a dishwasher. Nell was sitting at the table with a workbook open in front of her, but had not turned a page in several minutes. I noticed because her eraser had been resting against the same problem the whole time. She asked whether Grandma and Grandpa were going to get divorced. The question was so unexpected that I almost answered too quickly. I asked why she thought that. She had heard enough fragments over the past weeks to know adults were separating from one another. Calvin and Valerie were living apart. Mom and Dad had been arguing. Family dinners had stopped. People called me, and I did not answer. In Nell's mind, the fracture had spread outward from one simple act. She had taken food first. Valerie slapped her. Then everyone began leaving. She looked down at her workbook and said, very quietly, that if she had just waited, none of it would have happened. That sentence did what my mother's calls had failed to do. It made me sit down. I did not give her a speech about abuse, family systems, or legal responsibility. A 12-year-old who believed she had broken the family did not need a lecture. She needed the burden returned to the adults who created it. I told her Valerie had chosen to hit her. Everything adults did afterward belonged to those adults. Nell rubbed the corner of the workbook page between two fingers. She said she knew. Then she added that knowing and feeling it were not the same. That sounded exactly 12, old enough to recognize the correct answer, young enough for the wrong one to remain in her body. I reached across the table but stopped before taking her hand. She saw the movement and gave me hers. We sat like that. Behind us, Owen had abandoned the dishwasher argument and was putting plates away with unusual care. Ben did not interrupt. The next day, I changed one small thing at home. Instead of assigning chores from habit, I wrote the week's household jobs on index cards and let the kids choose which ones they wanted first, then divided the leftovers. It was not a grand family reform. It produced no music-swelling moment. It produced Owen trying to claim check mail as a complete chore and Nell declaring she was willing to supervise him. Owen objected that supervision did not count as work. Nell leaned back in her chair and said management seemed to run in the family. Ben covered a laugh with a cough. I did not. It was the first joke Nell had made about any of it. Not about the slap. About us. About the absurdity of adults who believed directing other people was the same as doing the work. The moment lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then Owen accused her of inventing executive privileges. They argued over vacuuming instead. Normality came back in pieces. Rowan was having a harder time. By late November, Calvin had moved them into the furnished apartment in Windsor. It was close enough to Rowan's school that she could keep the same routine, but nothing about the place felt like home. Calvin told me later that the living room had one beige couch, one lamp, and a framed print of mountains neither of them recognized. The kitchen had exactly 4 forks. Rowan kept forgetting which cabinet held the mugs, because every cabinet looked identical. She joked about it at first. Then the practical inconvenience began wearing her down. She missed her own bed. She missed the dog they had left temporarily with a neighbor while housing settled. She missed the smell of her mother's coffee in the morning. She even missed the sound of Valerie opening and closing cabinets at 6:30 because she was always the first person awake. Leaving a controlling environment had not made every memory inside it bad. That fact confused Rowan more than anything. She began to wonder whether going to the Western Slope School was worth what it seemed to be costing. The thought did not arrive as surrender. It arrived as responsibility. That was how Valerie's worldview had become so deeply planted. Rowan called me one evening while I was folding laundry. She told me she had been looking again at programs closer to home. There was one within driving distance. Another would still require moving, but not 5 hours away. She framed the idea carefully. Maybe the closer program was practical. Maybe staying near Fort Collins would make it easier for her parents to work things out. Maybe choosing distance now would look like she was proving a point. I listened. The old version of me might have told her not to let fear choose her future. The newly self-conscious version of me was tempted to do the opposite and refuse all opinions so completely that she would feel abandoned. Both impulses were about me. So I asked what she wanted before any of this happened. That answer came faster. The Western Slope program. She had wanted it before the dinner, before the hotel, before Calvin moved out, before anyone was talking about lawyers. Then I asked, what had changed? Rowan went quiet. Her parents. That was what had changed. She said if she went closer, maybe Valerie would feel less threatened. Maybe Calvin would stop feeling caught between them. Maybe everyone could return to something that resembled normal. I looked at the laundry in my lap. One of Owen's socks had somehow attached itself to the sleeve of Ben's shirt. A ridiculous domestic problem. I thought about how many times children absorb adult tension and then begin redesigning themselves to make the room easier. Nell had done it through helpfulness. Rowan was about to do it through geography. I did not tell her which school to choose. I reminded her only that her parents' marriage was not an admissions criterion. That line was enough. She laughed once, but it broke quickly. Then, she admitted she was tired of feeling as if every decision she made became evidence in a trial about whether she loved her mother. After we hung up, I stayed on the edge of the bed with the laundry basket between my knees. I could understand Valerie's fear more clearly than ever. Her daughter was preparing to leave. That hurt. Her husband had moved out. That terrified her. Her sister had reported the slap. That threatened her identity. None of those feelings gave her the right to decide that compliance was the only acceptable proof of love. Calvin reached a similar conclusion from a different direction. He came by our house the following weekend while Rowan was at school working on a project. He had a box of mail for Valerie that had been forwarded incorrectly and needed a place to sit for a few minutes before driving back. He looked exhausted. Not dramatic exhaustion, the slower kind. He moved like a man who had been carrying too many decisions without realizing how heavy decisions became when somebody else was no longer making them. He admitted that for years, when Rowan and Valerie fought, he often used one sentence to end his own discomfort. "Just make your mom happy." He said it with his eyes on the floor. He had told himself he was teaching compromise. Sometimes maybe he was. But sometimes he was teaching Rowan that the fastest way to restore peace was to make Valerie feel agreed with. That realization embarrassed him. He compared himself to Russell without meaning to. My father had used Valerie's competence to keep the household quiet. Calvin had used Rowan's compliance to keep his marriage quiet. Different generation. Same convenience. He told me one argument in particular had been bothering him. Months earlier, Rowan had wanted to leave the house after a college discussion became circular. Valerie took her keys and told her nobody drove angry. Calvin had agreed with that part. It sounded responsible. He told Rowan to stay. The argument continued nearly another hour. Only now was he asking whether the safety concern about driving had become an excuse to prevent the conversation from ending. Only now was Calvin asking whether a reasonable safety concern had become a way to keep the argument going. The rule mattered less than what it allowed in practice and who was permitted to end it. Valerie still wanted the answer to be her. She agreed to private therapy with Calvin in the final days of November. That surprised both of us. I did not attend. Rowan did not attend the first sessions either. Nell certainly did not. What I knew about those meetings came from Calvin afterward, and even then he did not give me every detail. Valerie arrived prepared and willing to admit that she should not have hit Nell. But the apology still came wrapped in an explanation. She had been undermined. Rowan had grown disrespectful. I had normalized too much choice, and Calvin had rewarded escalation by leaving. The therapist kept the session on conduct, what happened when Rowan tried to end an argument, what Valerie believed parental authority allowed, and what would need to change before Rowan felt safe returning. Valerie called herself consistent rather than controlling and defended taking keys or a phone during escalation. The session left Calvin sad rather than relieved. Valerie had apologized for the action without surrendering the belief beneath it. Diane was less patient with the process. My mother called me after learning Valerie and Calvin had started therapy and treated it as the beginning of the end of the conflict. Valerie had admitted the slap was wrong. Counseling had begun. What else did I want? The question irritated me because it assumed the purpose was making me satisfied. It was not. I did not need my sister humbled. I needed my daughter safe. Those were different things. Mom suggested a family session before Christmas. Everyone together. A neutral professional. Nell could say how she felt. Valerie could apologize directly. The family could begin healing. On paper, it sounded almost responsible. In practice, it placed Nell back in the center of adult repair. The same child who had apologized after being slapped would be asked to enter a room full of adults, describe her pain, receive an apology, and then become the emotional hinge on which reconciliation might turn. I refused. Not angrily, not forever. But Nell would not be used as proof that the family was getting better. If she ever wanted a conversation later, that could be discussed around her needs. Not around Christmas. Not around Mom's desire to restore the table. Diane accused me of holding everyone hostage to one moment. Before I could answer, Dad took the phone from her. I heard only fragments as they argued on the other end. Then Russell spoke to me directly. He said I did not need to bring Nell. That was all. No grand apology. No declaration that Mom was wrong about everything. But it mattered. My father had spent most of his life believing neutrality meant staying out. This time he entered. Mom did not call again that day. The space helped. So did the fact that I had stopped expecting everyone's growth to occur at the same speed. Russell had begun seeing the problem. Diane still saw the consequences as excessive. Calvin had begun accepting responsibility. Valerie had begun admitting actions without surrendering the worldview beneath them. Rowan wanted freedom, and still missed her mother. Nell wanted safety, and still worried she had broken the family. Nothing moved cleanly. That was probably more honest. 2 days later, Rowan came to our house after school. She and Nell worked at opposite ends of the dining table. For nearly an hour, they barely spoke. Rowan worked on an application-related portfolio update. Nell finished math homework. Owen wandered through twice, once asking for tape, and once asking if anyone knew why his left glove was in the freezer. Nobody knew. Ben eventually found out Owen had been trying to cool down gum, stuck to it, and forgotten the entire glove. The girls laughed. Again, not healing as spectacle. Just life. Later, when Nell went upstairs, Rowan stayed at the table. She told me Valerie had asked her to come to therapy eventually. Rowan was not opposed. She simply did not want the first session to become a negotiation about moving home. I told her she could say that. Rowan stared at the edge of her laptop. Then she told me what frightened her most. It was not that Valerie would yell, not even that she would grab her wrist. It was that her mother would explain everything so well that Rowan would leave, believing the whole problem had been her own stubbornness. That sentence stayed with me. Valerie was good at explanations. So was I. Maybe every family had its own favorite weapon. Some used silence. Some used anger. Ours had learned to use reason until the person with less power stopped trusting their own discomfort. Rowan said she was still planning the campus visit. Calvin had offered to drive her in early March when the admitted student schedule worked with school. The Western Slope trip remained several months away, but the decision to keep it felt important now. She had almost canceled. She had almost chosen a local school before visiting the one she actually wanted. Not because the program changed, because the adults around her were suffering. She closed her laptop. Then she said the sentence that told me more than all the therapy summaries. She still thinks I'd be safe if I just obeyed. There was no anger in her voice. That was why I believed her. She sounded tired. She had finally found the difference between a rule and safety. One depended on what an authority expected. The other depended on whether her body and voice still belonged to her when the rule was disputed. I told her the campus visit sounded worth taking. Nothing more. No promise that leaving would fix her life. No suggestion that distance was automatically freedom. She nodded. On December 3rd, Calvin scheduled a legal consultation. He had not filed anything yet. He was still hoping therapy might produce enough change to avoid turning separation into a court process. But rent was being paid on 2 homes. Rowan was still 17. School decisions were coming. And neither he nor Valerie could continue pretending their parenting arrangement was functioning normally. The attorney did not ask him whether Valerie was a good mother. That question would have been almost useless. People could be loving and controlling, competent and frightening, devoted and wrong. The consultation focused on conduct, residence, decision-making. What had happened since the anniversary dinner? What Rowan had said? What Calvin had personally witnessed? The slap on Nell mattered because Calvin saw it himself. Rowan's fear mattered because it affected where she was willing to stay. Then the attorney asked a narrower question. Calvin later told me he knew the answer before the sentence was finished. Had Valerie ever physically prevented Rowan from leaving a conflict? Not argued with her. Not told her to stay. Physically prevented her. Calvin thought about the blocked doorway, the hand around Rowan's wrist, the car keys removed when she tried to leave. More than one night. More than one argument. More than once. For the first time, the question did not sound like family drama. It sounded like a fact someone outside our family would have to evaluate. Inside a family, behavior arrived wrapped in history and explanations. Outside it, The questions narrowed. Was a doorway blocked? Were keys taken? Did an adult strike a child? And did it hurt? The legal processes that followed were slow and ordinary, but the questions were harder to soften. The police report involving Nell remained open while statements were collected. Police collected statements from the people who had been at the table, including Ben, Dad, and Calvin, while Mom and Valerie were contacted separately. I did not ask anyone to summarize their versions for me. A victim advocate later explained that the prosecutor would review the evidence and contact us if more was needed. Then life resumed around the case. School mornings, homework, laundry, Owen losing things in improbable places. I wanted the process in the background, and Nell's childhood in the foreground. Calvin's process moved differently. On December 4th, he filed for divorce. He told me that himself, not immediately. He waited until the evening after Rowan had gone to sleep, then called while I was watering the herbs on my kitchen windowsill. The basil had begun leaning toward the glass, thin from winter light. I remember that because my hand stopped over the same pot for so long that water spilled into the saucer. 19 years of marriage became a filing date, the 4th of December 2026. The sentence should have sounded enormous. Calvin said it quietly. He did not tell me he had finally escaped Valerie. He did not call the marriage a mistake. He sounded like a man signing paperwork for a loss he still wished had another shape. Because Rowan was still 17, Calvin also requested temporary parenting orders and a child and family investigator. He explained the CFI's role simply: speak with the relevant people, consider safety and Rowan's wishes, and report on parenting arrangements while she remained a minor. No one needed 40 years of family history to ask what happened when Rowan tried to leave a room. Calvin filed the requests and waited. I heard about those steps because he told me. I never saw his private attorney emails. I never sat in court beside him. I was not a party to his marriage. That boundary became important as December moved forward. There were days when I knew less about what was happening between Calvin and Valerie than Mom did. That was appropriate. I had my own child to protect. Rowan had her own father. I could be available without becoming the person who managed their case. Rowan called me before her CFI interview because she was afraid of choosing the wrong words. Would grabbed sound too dramatic? Would took my phone sound too ordinary? I told her she did not have to solve the listener. She only had to be accurate. I was not present for the interview. Later, she told me she described the blocked exits, the wrist or forearm holds, the keys and phone, and the fact that arguments ended when Valerie decided they ended. She did not ask the investigator to punish her mother or choose a college. She wanted to be able to leave a room, return to a discussion later, and make her own decisions when she became an adult. Calvin was interviewed too. He had more to admit. Not wrongdoing in the same category as Valerie. Enabling. He described the times he had seen Valerie block a doorway and had treated it as persistence rather than a safety concern. He described the night she took Rowan's keys during a college argument, and he supported the decision because he did not want Rowan driving angry. He described how the concern about driving had turned into another hour of forced conversation. He acknowledged that for years he had told Rowan to make her mother happy because it restored peace faster. He did not tell me any of that proudly. He told me because the CFI had asked what he personally observed, and for once he could not answer from Valerie's summary. Valerie had her own account. I knew only what Calvin and Rowan later shared, and even then I tried not to turn their summaries into a private verdict. According to Calvin and Rowan, Valerie presented the same surface case she had made to the family. Teenagers need boundaries. Keys can be taken for safety. Parents sometimes have to finish difficult conversations, and Rowan had begun comparing our homes. Some of those premises were reasonable. The investigator's task was not to decide whether the words sounded reasonable, but to examine what the conduct had done. In Rowan's account, the keys and doorways had repeatedly kept her inside arguments she was trying to end. The CFI process continued through follow-ups and documents, While a temporary arrangement took shape, Rowan stayed primarily with Calvin in Windsor, and contact with Valerie became planned rather than automatic. She still accepted some contact and refused other opportunities. Paperwork had not erased the fact that she loved her mother. One afternoon, she came to our house after seeing Valerie for coffee. She looked almost cheerful at first. They had talked about ordinary things: a teacher Rowan disliked, a cousin's birthday, a television show they both watched. For 40 minutes, the relationship felt familiar. Then Valerie asked whether Rowan was ready to come home. The old pressure returned immediately. Not shouting, not threats, expectation. Rowan said no. Valerie began explaining why continuing to stay with Calvin made recovery harder. Rowan ended the conversation and left. The remarkable part was not that Valerie pushed, it was that Rowan walked out. No doorway blocked, no keys taken, no hand on her wrist. She told me she sat in Calvin's car afterward, shaking so badly she had to wait before starting the engine. Freedom did not always feel peaceful at first. Sometimes your body expected the old consequence even after it failed to arrive. Nell's case moved forward around the same time. The victim advocate contacted me again after the prosecutor reviewed the available material. The evidence was straightforward. Multiple eyewitnesses, Nell's statement, the photograph of the redness, her report of pain, and Valerie's admission that she struck her. The district attorney's office decided there was enough to proceed with a misdemeanor third-degree assault charge based on knowingly causing physical pain. I wrote down the legal wording carefully. It was a charge, not a conviction, and it addressed the slap rather than every argument our family had about Valerie. I read the notes twice. Then I put them in a drawer. I did not tell Nell immediately. She was at school. There was no reason to pull her out of math class because adults had finally put a number on a process. That afternoon I told her in simple terms. The prosecutor had decided the case would continue. There might be more questions later. She had done what she needed to do. Nell listened while sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the coffee table, sorting colored pencils for an art project. When I finished, she asked if she had to see Valerie. I told her not now. The tension left her shoulders so quickly that I saw it before she nodded. Then she went back to sorting pencils. Purple, blue, green. The law had just changed Valerie's status in a criminal case. For Nell, the important fact was that she did not have to sit across from the person who hit her. That difference kept me grounded. My mother did not take the charging decision well. I know because Dad told me, not because I called to hear it. Diane believed one violent act was being allowed to outweigh 44 years of competence and care. When she asked Dad to pressure me to seek a private solution, he refused. He did not give her a speech. He simply stopped helping her restore the old balance. For Russell, that was movement. Mom stopped speaking to me for several days afterward. I found I could live with the quiet. Valerie entered the criminal process through counsel. After that, the case belonged to assigned roles: her attorney, the prosecutor, the court, rather than another family meeting in which the most persuasive person could settle the meaning of what happened. By January, the two legal tracks had settled into the background rhythm of our lives. A court date on one calendar, a CFI appointment on another, a call from the victim advocate, an email Calvin summarized without forwarding me private details. Nothing cinematic, just time moving. One morning before school, Nell stood at the kitchen counter spreading peanut butter onto toast. Owen reached across her for the jam. She slapped his hand away lightly. Not hard, not angry, just enough to make him pull back. "Wait your turn," he complained. She ignored him. I watched the exchange and felt something inside me loosen. Nell was not becoming more obedient. She was becoming less careful about being convenient. That was healthier than any apology Valerie could have offered me. A few days later, an envelope arrived, containing formal information connected to the criminal case. I opened it at the kitchen table after the kids had left for school. The language was dry. Names, dates, courte information. The alleged conduct reduced to lines that fit inside standardized boxes. For several minutes, I stared at Nell's name, not the surname, not the date, the way she was described. There was no explanation that she had entered our family through adoption. No mention that she should have been grateful. No note that she had served herself before anyone else. No category for whether she had embarrassed an aunt or broken a grandmother's idea of manners. The paperwork did not call her difficult. It did not call her helpful. It did not call her adopted. It did not assign her a place. It described what mattered. She was a child. An adult had struck her. It caused pain. And for once, that was enough. I kept thinking about the simplicity of the paperwork as winter dragged toward March. The criminal case involving Nell continued in the background. Calvin's divorce case moved through its own slower machinery. The CFI had completed most of the interviews that mattered, temporary arrangements were holding, and nobody in our family had discovered a shortcut through any of it. That turned out to be useful. For years, Valerie had been the person who accelerated uncertainty. If something felt unresolved, she organized it, named it, assigned the next step, and pushed until everyone else stopped resisting. Now, some things had to remain unresolved. Rowan could love her mother and still refuse to go home. Calvin could miss his wife and still continue the separation. Russell could regret what he had taught Valerie without being able to repair 40 years in a conversation. I could protect Nell and still have to face the ways I had failed to protect her before the slap. None of those problems improved when somebody forced an answer too early. March brought the first thing in months that looked less like damage control and more like a future. Rowan and Calvin drove to the western slope for the admitted student visit. I did not go. That decision mattered more than I expected. Several months earlier, I might have convinced myself that an extra adult would make the trip easier. I knew enough about design programs to ask useful questions. I could help Rowan compare facilities. I could make sure she looked beyond the excitement of a campus tour. All of that would have been true. It still would have put me in the middle of a decision that did not belong to me. So Calvin drove. They left before sunrise on a Friday. Rowan texted Nell a picture from somewhere along the route of Calvin standing beside the car with a paper map in his hands, even though his phone was visibly mounted on the dashboard. Nell showed it to me at breakfast. The caption said only, "Dad does not trust technology." An hour later, another picture arrived. This one showed a highway sign they had apparently passed twice. Nell laughed hard enough that Owen came running from the next room because he assumed something dramatic had happened. Nothing had. Calvin had missed a turn. That was all. I liked the smallness of it. For months, every message involving Rowan had carried weight. Was she safe? Had Valerie contacted her? Was there a court update? Was she still planning college? Now she was laughing, because her father had managed to get lost while using 2 navigation systems at once. I did not hear much from them during the visit itself. That was appropriate too. When they came back Sunday evening, Rowan stopped at our house with Calvin before heading to the apartment. Her face looked different, not transformed, just occupied by something other than vigilance. She talked faster than usual. The design building had large studio windows facing west. Students left models on open work tables. One professor had spent 15 minutes explaining a project about shade, water use, and public courtyards in high desert towns. Rowan had walked through a studio where someone had built a scale model of a neighborhood around a narrow blue strip representing runoff. She described it with her hands. That was what I noticed. For months, Rowan's hands had told me when she was anxious. Fingers around backpack straps, thumb worrying frayed fabric, arms folded tightly when she expected to be contradicted. Now she used them to show me the size of a drafting table, the slope of a roof model, the width of a pathway on a site plan. Calvin sat beside her on the sofa, looking exhausted and pleased. He told me the campus tour guide walked too fast and spoke as if every stairway had historic significance. Rowan corrected him. Apparently, the guide's enthusiasm had been one of her favorite parts. They had eaten in the cafeteria. Calvin disliked the coffee. Rowan said that was because he had approached a college dining hall, expecting civilization. They had seen residence halls, the library, student support offices, and the part of campus Rowan would probably complain about in February, when snow made every uphill walkway feel twice as long. The visit did not make the school perfect, which kept it from becoming a fantasy. One dorm looked older than the photos online. The drive was long. Winter travel worried Rowan. Even with partial merit aid, family education savings, and Calvin's planned contribution, they would need to budget carefully. There were still practical questions. But for the first time since the anniversary dinner, Rowan talked about distance without talking about escape. She talked about classes, studios, roommates, internships, a professor whose work she wanted to read, a future that did not exist primarily as the opposite of Valerie. I had wanted that for her without realizing how important the distinction was. Leaving home because you are running from someone is not the same as choosing a place because something there belongs to you. The first gives another person too much authorship. The second is a life. While Rowan was beginning to picture one, Nell was practicing smaller choices. Some were so ordinary I almost missed them. She stopped agreeing automatically when Mom asked through text whether she wanted to talk. Sometimes she did. Sometimes she did not. She changed her mind about going to a friend's birthday sleepover, after initially saying yes, and did not invent an illness to make the refusal more acceptable. At dinner, she told Ben she did not like the soup he had made. That moment nearly made me laugh. Before November, Nell would have eaten half the bowl, quietly found crackers later and thanked him anyway. Now she tasted it, made a face, and said she hated the texture. Ben looked offended for approximately 3 seconds. Then Owen tasted his, and announced that it felt like wet vegetables trying to become a blanket. Ben informed both children that culinary criticism had become unusually hostile in our home. Nobody apologized. Nell made herself toast. The evening continued. That was the point. Choice did not have to become a ceremony. I had been so focused on teaching Nell, she was allowed to say no, that I almost turned every no into proof of recovery. She did not need me applauding whenever she disliked something. She needed dislike to be ordinary. The same was true when she said yes. Sometimes she still offered to help me fold laundry. Sometimes she still carried groceries without being asked. Sometimes she made Owen a sandwich because he was running late. Those choices mattered too, because they were no longer the price of being good. By then, I had learned enough to see where my own accountability had stopped short. I had admitted that I missed the pattern. I had acknowledged that I chose easy explanations. I had changed some routines at home. Those were not the same as telling Nell exactly what I had done. There was one sentence I had been avoiding, not because I had forgotten it, because I remembered it too clearly. The moment came on an ordinary Thursday evening. Nell was sitting at the dining table, working through a science worksheet while I sorted mail beside her. Ben had taken Owen to pick up new sneakers after the old pair finally developed a hole large enough for his sock to become visible. The house was quiet. Rain tapped softly against the window. Nell had one leg folded beneath her and was chewing the end of a mechanical pencil, even though I had told her a dozen times not to. I looked at her and understood that if I waited for a dramatic opening, I would be repeating the same habit I was trying to break. Waiting until discomfort became large enough to justify attention. So I put the mail down. I told her there was something I needed to own. Nell looked up. I reminded her of a family cookout months before the anniversary dinner. Valerie had called for help. Nell had not wanted to stop what she was doing. I had said something I probably considered harmless. I repeated the sentence exactly. If Aunt Valerie asks you to help, just do it. She does a lot for everyone. The pencil stopped against Nell's lip. I did not soften the sentence with an explanation of what I had intended. Intent was not the missing information. I told Nell I had said it. She had heard it correctly. And by saying it, I had told her that Valerie had a kind of authority over her I should never have handed over so casually. Nell looked back at the worksheet. For a while, neither of us spoke. The rain made a faint ticking sound against the glass. I could hear the refrigerator cycle on in the kitchen. Nell erased one number, even though she had not been working on the problem anymore. Then she said the sentence had mattered. More than I knew. When Valerie called her away from games, or asked her to carry things, or told her to stay behind after meals, Nell sometimes remembered what I had said. Just do it. She had not interpreted it as one request at one cookout. She had heard a rule. Aunt Valerie does a lot for everyone. Therefore Aunt Valerie gets to ask. Therefore Nell should comply. And, because I had been the one to say it, Nell thought I wanted her to behave that way too. Different from Owen. Different even from Rowan sometimes. I wanted to tell her I had never meant for any of that to happen, but she already knew I loved her. What she needed was for me to recognize what my words had done. So I listened. Nell told me there were times she wanted to complain, but stopped because she assumed I had already decided helping Valerie was normal. She had not hidden some enormous secret. That was important. There was no alternate history where Nell had begged for help and I refused. There had been smaller moments. A sigh. A comment about Grandma being different. A quiet car ride. A reluctance to stop playing. Signals easy enough for an adult to explain away. I had explained them away. When Nell finally stopped talking, she kept her eyes on the worksheet. I apologized. No defense. No request for forgiveness. No promise that I would never make another mistake. I told her she had deserved a better question from me before the slap ever happened. The room stayed quiet. Part of me wanted her to reach across the table. Part of me wanted the story to give me that. A child saying it was okay. A hug. A line that let me know I had repaired the right thing in the right way. Nell did not do that. She clicked the pencil several times. Then she looked at me. I know you believe me now. That was all. It was not absolutintra. Tindhopsintra. Tingatintros. And for later, tingre. Tingra. It was not absolution. It was more valuable. She said no. She said no. So I went back to the mail. 5 minutes later, she asked whether we had any chocolate. I found some in the pantry. The evening moved on. I thought about that conversation several times over the next week, especially when Dad called. Russell had finally spoken to Valerie about her childhood. Not through me. Not because I arranged it. He told me afterward because he needed to say aloud what he had admitted. He had asked Valerie to meet him at the house. Mom was out. For once, there was no family audience. Dad told my sister they had put too much on her when she was young. He did not use modern terminology. He did not say parentification. Russell spoke in the language he understood. They had let her carry things that belonged to adults. They praised her because she handled them well. Then, instead of taking things back, they gave her more. According to Dad, Valerie did not cry. She became angry. That sounded more like her. She told him it was easy for everyone to discover now that she had been asked to carry too much. Audrey had gotten to be the easy child. Audrey had forgotten permission slips because Valerie remembered them. Audrey could get upset because Valerie knew how to calm Mom down. Audrey had grown into the relaxed parent everybody admired because Valerie had learned the consequences of what happened when nobody controlled anything. Some of that was unfair. Some of it was true. Dad did not argue her out of the true parts. That may have been the most important thing he did. He did not tell her I was younger, and therefore innocent. He did not point out that I had been a child too. He let the grievance stand. Valerie had lost something in our childhood. Freedom. Carelessness. The right to make mistakes without the household depending on her. My parents had taken those things from her, slowly enough to call it maturity. Dad admitted it. Then he told her the past could explain why control felt like safety, without giving her ownership of someone else's body. The conversation ended badly. Valerie accused him of rewriting their family, because everyone needed a reason to make her the villain. Dad told me he almost apologized for bringing it up. The old reflex. Restore calm. Make the room functional again. He stopped himself. They did not reconcile. That was probably the more honest outcome. Understanding someone's injury does not guarantee they will surrender the weapon they built from it. Valerie remained convinced that everyone else was using her childhood against her. Rowan's 18th birthday was approaching. That deadline changed the pressure. The temporary family law arrangements still mattered while she was 17, but April was close enough that everybody knew the court could not choose Rowan's residence forever. Valerie knew it most of all. She began contacting Rowan more often. Not constantly, not enough to violate anything in place, but with urgency. She wanted to talk about college before decisions became permanent. She wanted another chance to explain the local options. She wanted Rowan to understand what 5 hours really meant. Distance, weather, cost, emergencies, family. Some of those concerns were legitimate. They simply were no longer Valerie's to decide alone. Rowan agreed to one conversation. She told Calvin beforehand that she would leave if it became another argument about obedience. Calvin did not attend. Neither did I. What happened came to me later from Rowan. They met in a public place. For the first part of the conversation, Valerie stayed calm. She asked about the campus. Rowan told her. The studio spaces, the dorms, the drive, the finances. Valerie listened. For a little while, Rowan thought they might get through the conversation without returning to the old pattern. Then Valerie asked whether the visit had been Calvin's idea. Rowan said no. Was it mine? No. Was Rowan still sure she had wanted that school before all the conflict? Yes. Valerie kept circling the same concern. How could a 17-year-old separate what she truly wanted from what had become symbolic? If she went 5 hours away now, was she choosing a program or making a statement? That question was fair enough that Rowan had already asked it herself. The difference was that she had gone to campus and found an answer. She wanted the program. She wanted the studio. She wanted the work. She wanted the experience of living away from home. She would have wanted those things even if the anniversary dinner had never happened. Rowan told Valerie she intended to enroll if the financial plan held. The sentence apparently changed my sister's face. Valerie asked whether Rowan understood what she was doing to their relationship. Rowan said she was going to college. Valerie heard abandonment. She told her daughter that after everything that had happened, the apartment, the legal case, the CFI, the separation leaving now, would make rebuilding almost impossible. She asked why Rowan could not choose one thing that did not pull the family farther apart. There it was again, a teenager's future, carrying adult responsibility. Choose the closer school. Make reconciliation easier. Be the person who takes less space so everyone else can feel safer. Rowan told me afterward that, for 1 second, she almost gave in. Not because she changed her mind about school, because she knew exactly what sentence Valerie wanted. Fine, Mom. I'll stay closer. The old answer. The easy answer. The answer that made the room settle. Instead, Rowan looked at her mother and said, I can love you and still leave. Valerie had no immediate response. For years, her entire system depended on two things being the same: love and obedience, belonging and compliance, staying and loyalty. Rowan had separated them in 7 words. She was not rejecting her mother. She was refusing the definition Valerie had built around motherhood. I can love you and still leave. When Rowan told me the sentence later, she did not sound triumphant. She sounded shaken. There had been no victory in watching her mother's face go still. But for the first time, Rowan had disappointed Valerie without disappearing inside the disappointment. And that was a future nobody else could choose for her. For weeks afterward, Rowan's sentence seemed to do more damage to Valerie's worldview than any filing, report, or court date. Not because Rowan used it as a weapon. She didn't. She did not repeat it at family gatherings or send it in messages designed to hurt her mother. She said it once, in a public place, and then lived according to it. By spring, change came through ordinary administrative steps rather than dramatic leaps. Calls returned after school, legal documents on kitchen counters, appointments scheduled weeks out. The systems were moving, just slowly. By then, the CFI's work had progressed enough for the court to review and continue the temporary arrangement already in place. I knew only what Calvin and Rowan told me. Rowan remained primarily with Calvin, with contact with Valerie structured rather than automatic until she turned 18. The order did not solve their relationship. It gave Rowan time without restoring the old assumption that Valerie decided when she returned home or when a conflict ended. Valerie hated it. I knew that not because she called me, but because Mom began calling Dad more often. And Dad, with increasingly little patience for being used as a messenger, occasionally told me the parts that mattered. Valerie believed the system had rewarded defiance. That word again. Defiance. Disobedience. Influence. She could describe the same facts through different words and preserve the same conclusion. Rowan left because other adults encouraged her. Calvin filed because I made the slap into something bigger. The CFI misunderstood normal parenting because modern culture had become afraid of authority. Every consequence remained somebody else's interpretation of Valerie's intentions. What she still struggled to see was that the intentions were no longer the question. The court had not restricted her because it could see inside her heart. It reacted to behavior. That distinction remained unbearable to her. At home, Nell barely cared about any of it. The family case did not involve her directly. The court's temporary parenting arrangements were not something we discussed over dinner. Her concerns were smaller. She had a science presentation in March, and became convinced her teacher would notice the corner of her poster had bent. Owen had discovered a talent for making paper airplanes, and a complete lack of judgment about where to fly them. Ben's work became busy enough that he started leaving before sunrise twice a week. Life kept making demands unrelated to Valerie. I was grateful. One afternoon, Nell came home angry because another student had borrowed a marker without asking. 6 months earlier, I might have smiled at the triviality of it. Now I appreciated the anger. She was allowed to be annoyed about a marker. Not every boundary needed to be linked to adoption, trauma, or family hierarchy. Sometimes another kid took your marker. Sometimes you got it back. Sometimes you complained all the way home. That was childhood too. Rowan's 18th birthday arrived on April 14th. There was no courtroom scene attached to it. No judge handed her freedom. She woke up 18. That was all. Calvin bought a grocery store cake because the bakery order he thought he had placed online had somehow remained in his cart. Rowan sent Nell a picture of it leaning slightly to one side with the words, "Dad has failed birthday infrastructure." Nell showed me before breakfast. Owen said the cake looked fine. Nell said his standards were the reason civilization declined. I laughed hard enough that coffee nearly went down the wrong way. The birthday itself was small. Rowan did not want a large family gathering. She had dinner with Calvin, spent part of the afternoon with 2 friends, and came by our house later that weekend. Valerie sent a gift. Rowan opened it. She did not reject it to prove a point. She did not interpret accepting it as forgiveness. A gift could remain a gift. That was another form of autonomy. The legal meaning of her birthday was simpler. The temporary parenting arrangement no longer decided where she lived. No one could order an 18-year-old to return to her mother's house. No parenting schedule could force a visit. The family law case between Calvin and Valerie continued because their marriage still existed, but Rowan's body and residence no longer sat inside the center of it. For the first time, her relationship with Valerie became exactly that. A relationship, not a parenting schedule, not a legal obligation, not something another adult could enforce for her own good. The change frightened Rowan almost as much as it relieved her. Freedom sounds clean when you imagine it from a distance. Up close, it contains responsibility. If Rowan saw Valerie, it would be because she chose to. If she did not, that decision belonged to her too. There would be no court order to blame, no temporary arrangement to hide behind, no adult authority to say the choice had already been made. She had wanted that freedom. Now she had to live inside it. The criminal case involving Nell moved more slowly. By late spring, Valerie's attorney and the prosecutor were discussing resolution. Again, I knew only what I was entitled to know. The victim advocate kept me updated about the practical steps and what might be required from Nell. The possibility of a negotiated plea became more likely. I had mixed feelings about that at first. Some small part of me, probably the least useful part, wanted the simplicity of a trial. Evidence presented. Decision announced. Something final. Then I thought about Nell sitting in a courtroom, answering questions about why she took mashed potatoes first. I thought about making her relive a slap so adults could produce the cleanest possible moral ending. A negotiated resolution did not erase what happened. It might reduce how much of Nell had to be consumed by proving it. That mattered more. The facts remained the same. Valerie had struck a 12-year-old. Multiple people saw it. Nell experienced pain. The redness had been photographed. Valerie had never denied the contact itself. The legal question was no longer whether the slap occurred. The resolution became about responsibility and consequence. By May, counsel had reached an agreement the judge was willing to accept. Valerie entered a guilty plea to the misdemeanor-level assault charge tied to knowingly causing physical pain. The judge accepted the plea. The sentence was proportionate rather than spectacular. Probation, behavioral intervention focused on anger and conflict management, and fines and court costs. Valerie kept her job and her home. The state did not have to destroy her life to establish that striking Nell was unlawful. Nell never became a symbol. I did not post about the case. I did not write a long message to relatives explaining the outcome. I did not forward documents to people who had doubted me. That restraint was not some noble accomplishment. There simply was no reason to do those things. Nell had already spent too much time inside a story adults kept trying to define. She did not need me turning her into evidence of my righteousness. When I told her the case had resolved, she was sitting on the back steps eating watermelon. June heat had started settling over Fort Collins, and juice ran down the side of her hand. She listened. I told her Valerie had accepted legal responsibility and would have to follow the court's requirements. Nell asked whether she had to do anything else. I said no. Her shoulders dropped. Then she looked at the watermelon and complained that Owen had taken the piece with fewer seeds. That was the end of her interest. I remember thinking that adults often confuse closure with attention. We imagine the victim will want to stand in the center of the resolution because that is where the story has placed them. Sometimes the victim wants the freedom to care more about fruit. The social consequences were quieter and, in some ways, more permanent. For years, family communication had flowed through Valerie because she remembered the dates, booked the restaurants, and told everyone what needed doing. After the dinner, people began contacting one another directly. At first, the result was messy. A duplicated dessert here, a forgotten detail there, but nothing collapsed. The family learned that imperfect coordination was survivable, and Valerie was no longer indispensable to every room she entered. Calvin reached his own endpoint more slowly. He and Valerie continued therapy for several months, not to save the marriage at any cost, to determine whether there was enough shared ground left to rebuild something different. There were moments when Calvin thought there might be. Valerie softened around certain things. She acknowledged that blocking Rowan's exit had escalated conflict. She admitted taking keys had sometimes been about keeping the conversation going rather than driving safety. Those admissions were real. Then another disagreement would come, and the old structure returned. Valerie still saw the central betrayal as other people refusing her authority. She could describe a behavior as wrong without surrendering the belief that greater compliance would have prevented the behavior from being necessary. That gap became too large for Calvin. He told me in June that they were moving toward finalizing the divorce. He did not frame it as punishment for the slap. That would have been dishonest. A marriage of 19 years does not usually end because of one dinner. The slap exposed the system. The months afterward tested whether the system could change. Calvin decided it could not change enough for him to return. He took responsibility for his part too. For years, he had accepted Valerie's management because it made his life easier. He had treated her competence like a service. Then, when the same competence hardened into control, he acted surprised. He no longer allowed himself that innocence. Their lawyers worked through the remaining practical pieces of the marriage property, accounts, insurance, the accumulated objects of 19 years. There was no revenge mechanism in the division. Only two adults separating a shared life after the months since November had shown Calvin that the old structure would not change enough for him to return. Valerie blamed me anyway. That conversation came in July. I had not planned it. I was leaving a garden center after picking up plants for a client when I saw her near the parking lot. For several seconds, neither of us moved. It had been months since we stood face to face without other people nearby. She looked thinner. Not ill, tired. Her hair was pulled back, and she wore the same kind of structured work clothes she had always preferred. Nothing about her appearance announced punishment. That was appropriate. Consequences rarely make people visually symbolic. She looked like my sister. That was harder. There had been a time when seeing Valerie unexpectedly meant remembering some family story, or asking whether Mom had called her too. Now my body tightened before my mind caught up. She approached. I did not leave. There were things I would never discuss with her again. Nell's access was not negotiable. The legal case was resolved. Rowan's choices were Rowan's. But I was not afraid of a short conversation in a parking lot. Valerie asked whether I was satisfied. The word almost made me angry enough to answer badly. Satisfied. As if all of this had been a project. As if Calvin's divorce, Rowan's move, and Nell's fear were items on a list I had wanted completed. I told her no. Valerie looked at me like she did not believe that. Then the old argument surfaced. She had lost her daughter, her husband, her standing in the family, her reputation with people who now looked at her differently. Everything, she said, had changed because I refused to let one terrible moment remain one terrible moment. I listened. There was truth inside the loss. She had lost things. Not literally everything, but enough to make the phrase from the anniversary dinner echo between us. You just lost everything. At the time I had not known what it would mean. Now we both did. The temptation was obvious. I could have told her she had done it to herself. That would have been satisfying. It also would have been too simple. The slap did not invent Calvin's passivity. It did not invent Rowan's fear. It did not invent Mom's hierarchy. It did not invent Dad's silence. It did not invent my failure to listen closely enough when Nell first told me she was treated differently. The cracks were already there. The dinner made them visible. So I told Valerie that, not as a speech, just the truth I had learned. The slap had not created every fracture. It had made the people living inside them stop pretending they could not see them. Valerie stared at me. For a moment, I thought she might argue. She did not. Her face changed in the smallest way. Not remorse exactly. Something more like exhaustion. She said I had always been good at making things sound clean. That landed too. Maybe I had. My version could become another kind of control if I used clarity to erase everything messy. So I did not tell her she was wrong to feel abandoned. She had been abandoned in pieces as a child, then depended on too heavily as an adult, then resisted when people finally stopped needing her to manage them. Pain can be legitimate even when the conclusions built from it are not. I told her I believed we had all helped create the family role she lived inside. Then I told her she was still responsible for what she did with it. That was as far as I could go. Valerie looked toward the garden center entrance. People moved around us, carrying bags of soil and trays of flowers. Nobody knew who we were. Nobody cared. There would be no audience for the ending. Eventually, she walked away. I watched her cross the parking lot and get into her car. No collapse, no scream, no final confession. She drove off. I stood there holding a receipt and a flat of small plants that suddenly felt heavier than they should have. That was justice too, maybe. Not watching someone fall. Watching the old explanation fail to put the world back. By August, Rowan was packing for college. Boxes appeared in Calvin's apartment. Sheets, a desk lamp, storage bins. Far too many extension cords until Calvin learned the dorm rules and removed half of them. Nell helped her make a list. Owen contributed nothing, except repeatedly suggesting snacks. Rowan's relationship with Valerie remained limited, not absent. Limited. A few messages. A birthday call. One coffee after graduation that ended without a fight. Enough to prove that boundaries did not require hatred. Not enough to restore the old access. Valerie wanted to see Rowan before move-in. That request became the last unresolved question of the summer. No court could decide it now. No temporary order. No CFI recommendation. No father. No aunt. No mother. Rowan was 18. She could choose the meeting, choose the terms, choose not to go. And for the first time in her life, there was no one left with the authority to turn that choice into obedience. Freedom did not make the choice easy. Valerie wanted to see her before move-in, not to stop the college plan. By then, even my sister understood that argument was over. Rowan had graduated. She was 18. The tuition plan was in place. The room assignment had arrived. Calvin had already bought bedding in a color Rowan hated and returned it after she informed him that neutral beige was not a personality. The remaining question was smaller. Would Rowan see her mother before she left? For several days, Rowan did nothing. That was new too. In the past, silence around Valerie usually meant pressure building. A message unanswered for too long became another message. A decision delayed became a conversation about avoidance. Rowan had learned that if she did not choose quickly, Valerie would begin choosing around her. Now nobody did. Calvin did not tell her what would be healthiest. I did not ask what she planned. Even Nell, who knew something was unresolved, left it alone. Rowan carried the question herself. Eventually, she decided she would meet Valerie once before school began. Not at Valerie's house. Not at Calvin's apartment. Not in some symbolic family location, where memory could become another argument. A coffee shop. Late morning. 45 minutes. Her terms. If the conversation turned into a debate about college, blame, or whether Rowan had been manipulated, she would leave. Calvin told me about the plan only after Rowan had already chosen it. By then, we had all become better at recognizing the difference between support and management. The meeting happened 2 weeks before move-in. I was not there. What I know came from Rowan afterward, and even then she told me only what she wanted me to know. Valerie arrived early. Of course she did. She had brought something small for Rowan's dorm room, a compact toolkit with a screwdriver, measuring tape, and the kind of little household items a 17-year-old once would have rolled her eyes at, and secretly used within a week. Rowan accepted it. They talked about move-in time, parking, whether the residence hall elevators would be chaos, the fact that Calvin had printed the instructions, even though everything existed on his phone. For a while, it felt almost ordinary. Valerie did not ask Rowan to stay. She did not say Audrey had poisoned her against the family. She did not tell her that leaving proved anything about her character. That restraint was real. So was what remained underneath it. Near the end, Valerie asked whether Rowan believed they would ever be close again. Rowan did not promise. That was perhaps the hardest answer she could have given without being cruel. She said she wanted contact, but not the old version of contact. She would answer some calls. She would visit when she chose. She would leave conversations that stopped feeling respectful. She would not report every decision simply because Valerie was her mother. She would not use distance as punishment. She would not surrender distance as proof of love either. Valerie listened. Rowan told me her mother's face changed several times, but she did not interrupt. There was no dramatic breakthrough, no apology that repaired everything, no embrace in which the past disappeared. When the 45 minutes were over, Rowan stood. Valerie stood too. For 1 second, Rowan thought her mother might ask for a hug. She did not. Rowan chose one anyway. Brief, real. Then she left. The relationship was not restored. It had become possible. Those were different things. Valerie's life continued in ordinary ways. She went to work, remained in her home, and complied with probation and the required intervention program. The divorce was final, Rowan was leaving for college, and Valerie no longer occupied the automatic gatekeeper role she had once held in the extended family. Other people handled their own plans, sometimes badly, and the family survived the disorder. That loss of indispensability reached closer to the center of Valerie's identity than any fine could have. Mom learned more slowly. Diane's first apology to me was not useful. It came disguised as grief. She missed the grandchildren. She hated that holidays had changed. She wished none of this had happened. All true. None of it addressed Nell. I did not reward the attempt just because it sounded softer than her earlier defenses. Then, near the end of July, she asked whether she could write Nell a note. I said no, not because letters were inherently dangerous, because I did not want Nell receiving a carefully composed argument. She then felt obligated to answer. If Mom had something to say, she could say it to me first. Diane agreed. A week later, she came to my house while Nell was at a friend's. She sat at our kitchen table, the same table where I had apologized to my daughter months earlier. Mom looked smaller there than she had at her own dining table. Maybe because she was not controlling the room. She did not begin with how she had been raised. She did not explain the generation she came from. She did not tell me gratitude used to mean something different. She said she had treated Nell as though joining the family later meant she had more to prove. She admitted the sentence from the anniversary dinner had not been an accident. She had believed some version of it. That was the part that mattered. Then she said she had been wrong. No request for immediate access. No complaint about how much time had passed. I asked whether she understood that apologizing would not automatically mean Nell wanted to see her. Mom's hands tightened around each other. She said yes. I believed she meant it. That did not mean I trusted the change yet. I told Nell about the conversation that evening. Not every word. Enough. Mom had apologized. She understood the problem more clearly. Nell could decide whether she wanted contact. Nell thought about it while sitting on the floor, sorting clothes into a pile she insisted was clean enough, and another pile that even she admitted required washing. She said she was not ready for dinner at Grandma's. Then she asked whether Grandma could come to one of Owen's soccer games sometime, because there would be lots of other people there, and she could leave with us whenever she wanted. It was such a Nell answer. Not forgiveness, not rejection. A controlled test. I told her we could do that if she still wanted it when the season started. She nodded and went back to the laundry. Dad's rebuilding looked different. Russell had fewer words. More repetition. He called before visiting. He asked the kids what they wanted, instead of deciding what would be easiest. If Nell said no, he did not ask a second time disguised as persuasion. At first he overcorrected so badly that everyone noticed. One Sunday afternoon, he came over for lunch. Ben had made roast chicken and mashed potatoes. Dad sat beside Nell and asked whether she wanted more potatoes. She said no. He nodded solemnly. 5 minutes later, the serving bowl came back around, and he asked whether she wanted him to move it closer in case she had changed her mind. Nell looked at him. "Grandpa, it's mashed potatoes. You're making it sound like we're signing a treaty." Russell froze. Then he laughed. Not the uncomfortable laugh of someone being corrected by a child. A real one. He moved the bowl along. That was the first time I saw Nell tease him without checking my face afterward. Something inside their relationship had loosened. Trust did not come back because Dad said the correct thing once. It returned through small evidence. A knock before entering. A no accepted the first time. A ride offered without guilt attached. Nothing dramatic enough to post online. Exactly the kind of things that had been missing before. Owen adjusted faster than all of us. Children often do once adults stop requiring them to carry the meaning. He still annoyed Nell. Possibly more than ever. They fought over the television. They accused each other of stealing chargers. Owen developed a habit of taking the last sparkling water, even though he claimed not to like it, apparently because competition improved the flavor. One afternoon I heard Nell shout from the kitchen that if he touched the leftover pizza she was saving, she would report him to the authorities. Owen shouted back that Mom was the authorities. Nell said that was exactly the problem. Ben looked at me over his laptop. I almost choked laughing. There was something beautiful about how ordinary their conflict had become. Nell no longer treated every preference like evidence she deserved to belong. If she wanted the pizza, she said so. If Owen annoyed her, she complained. If Ben made something she hated, she declined it. If I asked for help and she was busy, sometimes she said later, she still helped plenty. That was the part I wanted to protect most. She did not need to become selfish to prove she was free. She needed generosity to become hers again. That took me longer to understand than I am proud of. For months, I had concentrated on the ways others used Nell's adoption against her. Eventually, I had to ask what my own fear of doing that had cost. I had spent years wanting adoption not to be the first explanation for anything. I thought that was fairness. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it became avoidance. Nell's adoption was not a wound I needed to erase from her identity. It was part of her story. She had memories from before us, questions we could not always answer, experiences Owen did not have. People in the extended family could use that difference kindly, ignorantly, or cruelly. Pretending nobody saw it did not make her equal. It made me less prepared to notice when someone turned it into hierarchy. One evening in August, while Rowan's moving boxes were beginning to take over Calvin's apartment, Nell and I sat on the back porch together. She was eating a popsicle and watching insects gather around the porch light. I told her there was one more thing I wanted her to know before the family changed again with Rowan leaving. Not an apology this time. Something I had learned. Her adoption was real. It mattered. Not because it made her less ours. Because it belonged to her. She did not have to treat it as a secret category nobody was allowed to mention. If someone used it to make her smaller, I wanted her to tell me. If I missed something, I wanted her to tell me that too. I would not promise never to misunderstand again. That kind of promise would have been for me. I told her I would ask better questions. Nell listened with the popsicle melting down one finger. Then she wiped her hand on her shorts before I could stop her. That was her response. No speech about family. No reassurance that I was the best mother in the world. She asked whether adoption meant she could refuse to inherit my habit of making speeches on the porch. I told her absolutely not. Some things were genetic only in spirit. She groaned, then leaned her shoulder against mine. I did not need anything more from the moment. Rowan's move-in date came at the end of August. Calvin had spent the previous week arranging boxes by category. Rowan immediately ignored the system. She packed clothing into a bin labeled desk supplies, because it had extra space, which Calvin treated as an offense against written language. Nell helped fold bedding. Owen contributed a bag of snacks so large that Calvin asked whether the residence hall lacked food. Owen told him college students required emergency reserves. Nobody trusted his definition of emergency. The night before Rowan left, we had dinner at our house. Not the whole extended family. That would have been too much. Just the people who could sit in one room without asking the evening to repair what it could not. Ben, Owen, Nell, Calvin, Rowan. Dad came for the first hour. Mom did not. That had been Nell's choice. Diane knew about the dinner and did not complain. That was another small piece of evidence. We did not make the meal ceremonial. No speeches, no presentation about Rowan's future. Ben grilled chicken. Calvin brought salad. Rowan brought a dessert she had bought herself, because she said the adults in her life had demonstrated unreliable dessert coordination. Owen objected until he saw the brownies. Then he withdrew the criticism. Conversation moved around ordinary things. Dorm rules. Whether Rowan would actually call Calvin. How long it would take Owen to raid her abandoned room at home, even though he did not live there. The fact that Rowan had packed 7 pairs of shoes and apparently considered that restraint. For once, college did not mean separation. It meant bad parking and too many extension cords. Dad left before dessert. He hugged Rowan. He asked Nell whether she wanted a hug too. She did. That was all. No one pointed out how much progress the question represented. After he left, the 6 of us stayed around the table. The evening light softened against the windows. Someone opened another bottle of sparkling water. Owen dropped a fork and blamed gravity, as if gravity had targeted him personally. Then Ben carried out the final serving bowl. It was a simple side dish. Nothing symbolic about it, until the bowl reached Nell. I noticed. Of course I noticed. Months earlier, that exact kind of moment had changed our family. A bowl, a spoon, a child checking whether everyone else had taken what they wanted before allowing herself to have something. For 1 second, I watched Nell's hand move. She did not scan the room. She did not look at me. She did not check Grandma's expression because Grandma was not there. She did not wait for Rowan. She did not angle the bowl toward Calvin. Nell picked up the serving spoon, put food on her plate, then passed the bowl to Owen. That was it. No pause. No bravery. No one clapped. No one told her how proud we were. She had already turned back toward Rowan and was asking whether her dorm had decent Wi-Fi. Owen looked at Nell's plate, then at the bowl. He immediately complained that her serving was larger than his. Nell told him he had eyes and a spoon and should use both. Ben sighed with exaggerated weariness and said civilization was clearly one serving-size lawsuit away from collapse. Rowan laughed. Calvin nearly dropped his glass. Nell took another bite. And I understood that this was what I had wanted all along. Not a daughter who became fearless. Not a family that never made mistakes. Not a perfect ending where everyone apologized in the correct order and the people who hurt us vanished. I wanted Nell to stop measuring her right to belong by how little space she took. Valerie's place in our lives was different now. Mom's was still uncertain. Dad's had to be rebuilt. Rowan was leaving the next morning with boxes, fear, excitement, and a mother she still loved from a distance she had chosen. Calvin would go back to an apartment that was too quiet. Ben and I would keep making parenting mistakes. Owen would continue believing every food portion was a constitutional issue. Nothing had become perfect. It had become honest. The rule beneath our family had finally changed. Love no longer meant the person with the most authority got to assign everyone else a position. Gratitude no longer meant silence. Helping no longer meant obedience. Leaving did not mean betrayal, and belonging did not have to be earned by standing behind everyone else. Nell reached for her water. Her elbow bumped Owen's. He complained. She told him to move. He did. The conversation continued. No one noticed the serving spoon resting beside her plate. That was The victory. Nell's place in our family had never been behind anyone. It was wherever she was allowed to stand as herself, and from then on, no one else got to assign it for her.